Welcome to Sleepy Poker. This quiet lesson explores the most common mistakes players make in low and mid-stakes poker tournaments. You will learn how these errors appear, why they quietly drain chips, and which small adjustments create a more stable and confident path through every stage of the event. The narration will stay soft and peaceful, so you can follow along or drift into rest. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Playing too many hands, early. Choosing speculative starting cards from early seats in a tournament often leads to unnecessary risk and difficult post-flop decisions. When the blinds are low and antes have not yet been introduced, the incentive to enter pots with marginal holdings is minimal. In these early levels, each player typically sits behind a deep stack of around 100 big blinds or more, and the average pot remains small, usually just 2.5 to 3 big blinds after a standard pre-flop raise. With little pressure from the blinds and no antes to chase, the value of stealing the pot is limited, especially from early positions where the likelihood of facing strong hands behind is high. This dynamic means that the chips you risk by playing too many hands early are rarely compensated by the potential reward, and the cost of a mistake can linger for many levels. The structure of early tournament play is designed to allow patience. With deep stacks and minimal blind pressure, players have the luxury of waiting for premium opportunities. Unlike later stages, where antes and escalating blinds force action and reward aggression, the early phase rewards discipline and selectivity. For example, a player in the cutoff or on the button may find more value in widening their range, as the chance to steal the blinds is greater, and the risk of running into a strong hand is lower. In contrast, opening from under the gun or the seat immediately after requires a much tighter approach. The average stack size remains close to the starting level, and the absence of antes means that the pot is not artificially inflated. This environment encourages a focus on hand quality and position, rather than speculative aggression. When players ignore these dynamics and adopt a loose pre-flop approach, the consequences can be costly. Entering pots with hands like King-Jack offsuit or Queen-10 suited from early seats often results in being dominated by stronger hands in opponents' calling ranges. These marginal holdings rarely perform well against the types of hands that continue from middle or late positions, especially when stacks are deep. The result is frequently a bloated pot, where the player with the weaker hand is forced to make tough decisions on later streets, often with little equity and poor pot odds. For instance, opening King-Jack offsuit from under the gun with 100 big blinds can lead to a situation where an opponent calls with a stronger ace or a pocket pair. After the flop, the pot may already be approaching 20 big blinds, and the original raiser is left facing continuation bets with a hand that is often second best. The pressure to call on the turn or river, simply because of the pot size, can lead to further chip loss. The difference between a disciplined and a loose pre-flop strategy is most apparent in the ranges chosen by position. A solid early position range is typically limited to the top 10 to 15% of hands. This includes pocket pairs from 7s upward, suited aces from ace-10 and higher, offsuit Broadway combinations like ace-jack or king-queen, and suited broadways such as king-jack suited. Expanding beyond this, to include hands like suited connectors or weak aces, increases the percentage of hands played to as much as 25 or 30%. This expansion may seem attractive, but it significantly reduces fold equity when facing 3-bets and exposes the player to domination by stronger hands. The win rate for these marginal hands in early tournament phases is low, and the risk of being outkicked or outflopped is high. Constructing a disciplined pre-flop strategy begins with understanding the value of position and the strength of starting hands. From under the gun, a recommended opening range might include only the top 12% of hands, all pairs from 2s upward, suited aces from ace-9, offsuit ace-jack or better, king-10 suited or higher, king-queen offsuit, and queen-jack suited. Moving to middle position, the range can widen slightly to include suited connectors from 7-6 upward. In the cutoff, the range expands further to include more offsuit broadways, while on the button, it is reasonable to play up to 40% of hands, adding suited aces and suited gappers. Adjustments should always be made based on the tendencies of the players at the table. If aggressive opponents are seated to your left, tightening up is prudent. Conversely, if the table is passive and folds frequently, widening your range to steal more pots can be profitable. To illustrate the dangers of loose pre-flop play in the early stages, consider a hand played at a full table with 100 big blinds effective. The player in the seat immediately after under the gun, holding 8 of clubs and 7 of clubs, decides to open the action with a raise to 2.5 big blinds. This is a speculative suited connector, and the choice to play it from such an early position is risky given the deep stacks and lack of antes. The player in the hijack, who acts after several folds, calls the raise. This opponent is likely to have a standard middle position range, which includes hands like ace-queen offsuit, king-jack suited, pocket nines, pocket sevens, ace-9 suited, queen-10 suited, and suited connectors down to 7-6 suited. The blinds fold, and the pot stands at 6.5 big blinds. The flop is revealed as queen of diamonds, 4 of spades and 2 of hearts. The first player, holding 8 of clubs and 7 of clubs, decides to make a continuation bet of 3 big blinds. The hijack calls. At this point, the original raiser has only high card value and no draw, while the opponent's range contains many hands that connect with this board or have significant equity. The turn brings the jack of clubs. The first player checks, and the hijack bets 6 big blinds. After some thought, the original raiser calls. Now the player with 8 of clubs and 7 of clubs still holds only high card value, with no pair or draw, while the opponent's range has improved with the addition of the jack, making hands like king-jack suited or ace-jack suited possible. The river comes as the 3 of spades. The first player checks again, and the hijack bets 15 big blinds. Facing a sizable bet, and holding only 8 high, the original raiser folds. The hijack collects the pot, later revealing king of spades and jack of spades, which is a pair of jacks. This outcome demonstrates how opening a speculative hand from early position in the absence of antes and with deep stacks can lead to a series of difficult post-flop decisions. The original raiser invested chips on every street without ever improving, and the opponent's well-constructed range easily dominated the marginal holding. The lesson from this hand is clear. In the early stages of a tournament, when stacks are deep and pots are small, the cost of playing too many hands from early position is high. Marginal holdings rarely realize their equity, and the lack of antes means there is little incentive to steal. By focusing on a disciplined, position-aware pre-flop strategy, players can avoid bleeding chips and reserve their stack for more favorable situations. The ability to wait for strong hands and act with patience is a defining trait of successful tournament players, especially in the early levels where the margin for error is greatest. Chapter 2: Ignoring position when choosing hands. Selecting hands without regard for seat location leads to frequent situations where opponents can exploit your range, resulting in lower win rates and more difficult post-flop decisions. The seat you occupy at the table fundamentally shapes which hands you should play and how profitable those hands will be over time. When you act later in the betting order, such as from the cutoff or button, you gain a significant advantage by seeing how most of the table responds before you commit chips. This information edge allows you to open a wider variety of hands, including speculative holdings, because you can better control the size of the pot and apply pressure with position on future streets. In contrast, acting from early seats like under the gun means you must navigate the actions of 7 or 8 players who have yet to act, each with the opportunity to call, raise, or fold. This increases the risk of facing multiple opponents or aggressive re-raises, both of which make it harder to realize the full value of your hand. The impact of position on profitability is clear when you examine win rates by seat. Players in early position typically earn between 10 and 17 big blinds per 100 hands, while those in middle position see a modest increase to around 14 or 15. The advantage grows as you move closer to the button, with cut-off players earning between 20 and 27 big blinds per 100 hands. The button itself is the most lucrative seat, offering win rates that can reach as high as 43 big blinds per 100 hands. This progression is not accidental. When you act last, you have the benefit of observing every opponent's action before making your own decision, which allows you to avoid marginal spots and maximize value with your strong hands. The button, in particular, acts last post-flop in most hands, giving you the final say in every betting round and the ability to control the pace and size of the pot. The range of hands you can profitably open expands dramatically as your position improves. In a 9-handed game, early position demands discipline, with opening ranges limited to about 10 to 12% of possible hands. This typically includes only high pairs, strong aces, and premium Broadway combinations. Middle position allows for a slight loosening, up to 15 or 18%, as there are fewer players left to act and a reduced risk of facing strong hands behind. The cutoff opens the door to about a quarter of all hands, while the button can profitably raise with as much as 40 to 50% of holdings. This includes not only premium hands but also suited connectors, suited aces, and all pocket pairs. The reason for this widening is simple. With fewer players to act behind, and the advantage of position, you can more effectively leverage your information edge and apply pressure to opponents who are out of position. Opening hands from early position carries unique risks that are often underestimated by less experienced players. When you raise under the gun, you are forced to act without knowing how the rest of the table will respond. With 7 or 8 players yet to act, the likelihood of facing a call or a re-raise is much higher than from later seats. This dynamic means that hands which are profitable from the button, such as suited connectors or Broadway cards like King-Jack offsuit, become liabilities when played from early position. The primary danger is domination. Hands like King-Jack are frequently up against stronger Broadway combinations such as Ace-King or Ace-Queen, especially when facing aggression from late position players who are incentivized to attack early opens with a wide range. Additionally, early position raises are more likely to result in multi-way pots, where the value of speculative or marginal hands drops significantly due to the increased chance of being outdrawn or outplayed post-flop. Aggression from late position is a constant threat to early position openers. Players on the button and in the cutoff are aware that early position ranges are supposed to be strong, but they also recognize that many tournament players open too wide from these seats. As a result, late position players frequently 3-bet with hands like suited aces, suited connectors down to 6-5 suited, and most pocket pairs. When you open from under the gun and face a 3-bet from the button, you are often forced to continue with hands that are dominated or fold after investing a significant portion of your stack. At tournament stack depths around 80 big blinds, calling a 3-bet after opening from early position can quickly commit nearly 10 big blinds to the pot, making it difficult to realize your equity against a wide and aggressive range. To illustrate the consequences of ignoring position, consider a hand played at 80 big blinds effective between under the gun and the button. The player in early position opens to just over 2 big blinds holding King of Spades and Jack of Diamonds. The action folds to the button, who holds a wide range typical for late position, including all Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors down to 6-5 suited, and most pairs. The button responds with a 3-bet to 7 big blinds. The blinds fold, and the under-the-gun player calls, committing a significant portion of their stack to the pot. The flop comes Queen of clubs, 7 of spades, and 3 of hearts. The under-the-gun player checks, and the button continues with a bet of 8 big blinds. After some thought, the under-the-gun player calls. At this point, the under-the-gun player holds only king high, with no pair and no meaningful draw, facing a board that heavily favors the button's range. The turn brings the 2 of spades. Once again, the under-the-gun player checks, and the button bets 18 big blinds. Now facing a large bet, and holding only king high, the under-the-gun player folds, conceding the pot to the button. Throughout this hand, the early position player's decision to open king-jack offsuit set up a difficult scenario. From under the gun, king-jack offsuit is a clear fold in tournament play because it is frequently dominated by stronger hands and performs poorly against aggression from late position. By opening this hand, the player exposed themselves to a wide 3-bet from the button, who can profitably attack early, opens with a variety of holdings. After calling the 3-bet, the under-the-gun player found themselves on a dry flop with no pair and no draw, forced to call a continuation bet with little chance of improving. The turn brought another bet, and with no improvement, the only option was to fold, resulting in a loss of nearly 10 big blinds without ever seeing a showdown. The button wins the pot, capitalizing on the positional advantage and the under-the-gun player's loose opening range. This hand demonstrates how failing to adjust hand selection for position leads to negative expected value decisions and unnecessary losses. The key to avoiding these costly mistakes is to adjust your opening ranges based on seat location. In early position, discipline is essential. Restrict your opens to about 12% of hands, focusing on high pairs, strong aces, and premium Broadway combinations. As you move to middle position, you can add a few more hands, expanding to around 16%. The cutoff allows for even more flexibility, with a recommended opening range of about 22%. On the button, you can open nearly half of all hands, including suited connectors, suited aces, and every pocket pair. For example, king-jack suited is a standard fold from under the gun because it is often dominated and difficult to play in multi-way pots, but it becomes a profitable open from the button, where you are likely to face only the blinds and can leverage your positional advantage. By consistently tailoring your hand selection to your seat, you reduce the risk of domination, avoid difficult post-flop spots, and maximize your long-term win rate. The discipline to fold hands like king-jack offsuit from early position, while opening them from the button, is a hallmark of strong tournament strategy. Position is not just a detail, it is a fundamental driver of profitability in poker. Recognizing its impact and adjusting your ranges accordingly is one of the most effective ways to improve your results and avoid the pitfalls that come from ignoring this essential concept. Chapter 3. Limping, instead of raising or folding. Entering a pot passively, with a weak or medium-strength hand, often results in a loss of control and a reduction in long-term winnings. When players choose to enter the action without raising, they immediately signal a lack of strength to observant opponents and invite a cascade of problems that begin before the flop and compound on later streets. In tournament play, this approach is especially costly, as it allows opponents to realize their equity cheaply and makes it difficult for the original limper to win the pot without a strong hand or favorable runout. The first and most significant danger of entering a pot without aggression is the weakening of your perceived range. When you simply call the big blind rather than raise, You communicate to the table that your hand is not strong enough to play for more chips. This opens the door for players in later positions to attack with a wide variety of hands, especially those who are attentive to position and stack sizes. For example, in a typical tournament setting, if you limp from middle position with 5 players yet to act, you will only reach the flop uncontested about 73% of the time when facing opponents who raise pre-flop with their top 6% of hands. This means that nearly 1 in 4 times, you will be forced to respond to a raise, often from a player in late position who can leverage position and a wider range to put you in difficult spots. Moreover, limping encourages overlimps, which quickly transforms the hand into a multi-way pot. In these scenarios, your hand's equity drops sharply. In a 5-way pot, for instance, your chance of winning falls to about 20%, even if you started with a hand that looked promising in isolation. The more players that see the flop, the more likely it is that someone will connect with the board in a way that beats your marginal holdings. This is why experienced players almost never limp behind others, regardless of their position. They understand that the profitability of limping diminishes rapidly as more players enter the pot, and that the best hands to play in these situations are those that can win big pots or fold easily when facing aggression. The strategic consequences of limping extend beyond just the strength of your range. By failing to raise, you forfeit the opportunity to win the pot outright, before the flop. Raising pre-flop gives you fold equity, allowing you to pick up the blinds and any limps without seeing a flop. This is a critical advantage, especially in tournament play, where chip preservation is vital. When you limp, you surrender this advantage and must rely on making a hand or outplaying your opponent's post-flop, often from out of position. Maintaining the betting initiative is another key benefit of raising or folding rather than limping. The player who raises pre-flop controls the size of the pot and dictates the action on subsequent streets. This control is especially important in deep stack situations with low antes, such as when both players have 120 big blinds. In these scenarios, raising allows you to isolate weaker opponents and play pots against a narrower range of hands, such as suited connectors, suited aces, Broadway cards, and pairs that are commonly found in late position ranges. By contrast, limping cedes this initiative, forcing you to react to the bets of others and making it much harder to extract value or protect your equity. To illustrate these concepts, consider a hand played at a deep stack table with 120 big blinds effective. The action begins with a player in middle position, holding the Queen of Diamonds and 10 of Diamonds. Rather than raising or folding, the player chooses to limp. The cutoff, holding a wide range typical for late position, responds with a raise to 5 big blinds. The button calls, and the original limper calls as well. At this point the pot has grown, but the original limper is now out of position against 2 opponents, one of whom has shown aggression. The flop comes 10 of spades, 7 of clubs, and 4 of spades. The middle position player checks, and the cutoff bets 8 big blinds. The button folds, and the original limper calls. At this stage the limper has made top pair with a queen kicker, which is a medium strength holding on this board. However, the hand is vulnerable to overcards, draws, and the aggression of the pre-flop raiser. The turn brings the 2 of hearts. The middle position player checks again, and the cutoff continues with a bet of 18 big blinds. The original limper calls, still holding top pair with a queen kicker, but now facing increasing pressure and a growing pot. The river is the 8 of clubs. Once more the middle position player checks, and the cutoff bets 35 big blinds. At this point the original limper decides to fold, unable to continue with just top pair in the face of sustained aggression and a coordinated board. The cutoff collects the pot, without a showdown. This hand demonstrates several of the pitfalls associated with limping. By entering the pot passively, the middle position player created a weak and capped range that was easily targeted by the cutoff's isolation raise. The result was a multi-way pot, where the original limper was forced to play out of position with a marginal hand. As the hand progressed, the limper faced increasingly difficult decisions, with the stack-to-pot ratio becoming less favorable on each street. Ultimately, the inability to control the pot size, or dictate the action, led to a fold on the river and a loss of chips. The underlying issue in this example is the poor stack-to-pot ratio created by limping and then calling a raise. In deep stack situations, such as 120 big blinds effective, limped pots often result in small pots relative to the stacks, which makes post-flop play awkward. When you are out of position and the pot is multi-way, it becomes challenging to size bets effectively, protect your hand, or extract value. Speculative hands like suited connectors, which might seem appealing to limp, actually require a higher equity threshold to be profitable when facing continued aggression from opponents who have the initiative. Furthermore, the success rate for players who limp and then call raises is significantly lower than for those who open raise. The lack of initiative and the presence of multiple opponents reduce the likelihood of winning the pot, both before and after the flop. This is why the most profitable approach in tournament play is to maintain a strategy of raising or folding rather than limping. By doing so, you keep your range strong, preserve fold equity, and retain control over the action and pot size. Adopting a disciplined approach to pre-flop play by avoiding limping will help you navigate tournaments more effectively. You will find yourself in fewer difficult spots, with stronger ranges, and better opportunities to leverage position and aggression. Over time, this adjustment will lead to improved results and a more resilient tournament strategy. Chapter 4. Misdefending the Big Blind. Giving up too many chips from the big blind can quietly erode your stack, while defending too loosely can lead to costly mistakes against strong ranges. The decision to continue from the big blind is not simply a matter of pot odds or hand strength in isolation. Instead, it is a nuanced calculation involving the raiser's position, their likely range, the size of the raise, and the structure of the tournament. When aunties are in play, the price to call from the big blind improves, meaning you need less equity to justify a call. For example, facing a standard raise of 2 to 2.5 times the big blind, you only need to win the pot about 1 time in 5 to break even. This mathematical reality encourages a wider defense, but only when the opener's range is itself wide enough to allow your marginal hands to realize their equity. The key to profitable big blind defense lies in understanding how your hand performs against the range of hands your opponent is likely to have. When facing an early position raise, the opener is typically playing a tight selection of hands, such as all pairs, most aces, and suited broadways. Against this range, many of the hands you might be tempted to defend, especially offsuit combinations, will struggle to connect with the board, or will be dominated when they do. In contrast, when the raise comes from the button, the opener is likely to be playing more than half of all possible hands, including many weak holdings. This means your marginal hands have a better chance to realize their equity, and you can profitably defend a much wider range. To illustrate the principles behind optimal big blind defense, consider the recommended approach in tournaments with antis. On average, you should be defending by calling about 1/4 of the time, and mixing in 3 bets with another 8% of hands. This balance prevents your opponents from exploiting you with frequent steals, while also protecting your stack from unnecessary losses against strong ranges. The minimum defense frequency concept is also important. If you fold too often, your opponents can profitably raise with any 2 cards. For example, if you face a pot-sized bet, You must defend at least half the time to prevent your opponent from automatically profiting with bluffs. These guidelines are not rigid rules, but they provide a solid framework for making informed decisions from the big blind. The dangers of over-defending the big blind become clear when you examine what happens against early position opens. Early position players are typically raising with a tight range, including all pairs, strong aces, and suited broadways. Many hands that look playable in a vacuum, such as offsuit broadways or weak-suited connectors, are actually dominated by this range. Offsuit hands in particular realize significantly less equity against tight opens, often 10 to 15% less than they would against a late position raise. Even suited hands, which have more potential to make strong post-flop hands, realize 5 to 10% less equity in these situations. The problem is compounded when the early position player uses a larger raise size, such as 3 times the big blind or more, as this further reduces your pot odds and increases the risk of losing a large pot with a dominated hand. Let's look at a specific hand that demonstrates the pitfalls of defending too wide against a tight early position raise. The table is playing 60 big blinds deep, with the under-the-gun player opening the action. Their range consists of strong hands, ace-king suited, ace-queen suited, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks, and pocket nines. The action folds around to the big blind, who holds queen of clubs and 8 of spades. Facing a raise to 2.5 times the big blind, the big blind calls. The flop comes ace of diamonds, 7 of spades, and 3 of clubs. The big blind checks, and the under-the-gun player bets 3.5 big blinds. The big blind calls again. On the turn, the 2 of spades appears. The big blind checks, and the under-the-gun player bets 7 big blinds. At this point, the big blind folds, and the under-the-gun player takes the pot. After the pre-flop call, the big blind is left with a weak hand on the flop, simply high card with no meaningful draw. The flop brings an ace, which heavily favors the under-the-gun player's range, and the big blind's queen-8 offsuit has little chance of improving. The call on the flop is made with the hope of catching a favorable turn, but the turn card does not help. The big blind is forced to fold after investing additional chips, having realized very little equity. This hand illustrates the core problem with defending too wide against early position. The hands you call with are often dominated, and you are left with difficult decisions on later streets, frequently having to fold after committing a significant portion of your stack. The strategic lesson here is that defending hands like queen-8 offsuit against a tight early position raise is a losing proposition. The opener's range is simply too strong, and your hand is too often dominated or unable to realize its equity. The result is a pattern of small losses that add up over time, quietly draining your stack. By tightening your big blind defense against early position, focusing on hands that can make strong top pairs or have robust drawing potential, you avoid these negative expected value situations. On the other hand, folding too often to late position steals can be just as costly, though in a less obvious way. When the button raises with a wide range, often more than half of all possible hands, they are relying on the blinds folding too frequently to make their play profitable. If you defend your big blind less than about 46% of the time in these spots, the button can profit simply by raising any 2 cards. The math is straightforward. When the button risks 3,200 chips to win 3,800, they only need to succeed about 45.5% of the time. If you and the small blind together defend less than this threshold, the button's steals become automatically profitable. To counter this, you must widen your big blind defense against late position opens. This means calling with a broader range of hands, including more offsuit broadways and suited connectors, especially when you are deeper stacked. The position advantage post-flop allows you to realize more of your equity, and the weaker opening range means your marginal hands are less likely to be dominated. By defending appropriately, you force the button to play more honestly and prevent them from picking up chips uncontested. Optimal big blind defense is a balancing act. Against early position, you must be disciplined and fold marginal hands that are unlikely to realize their equity. Against late position, you must be willing to defend wider to prevent your opponents from exploiting you with frequent steals. The example hand demonstrates the cost of over-defending against a tight range. Calling with Queen-8 offsuit against an under-the-gun raise leads to a difficult post-flop situation, where you are forced to fold after investing chips with little chance to win. By understanding the principles of big blind defense, adjusting for position, raise size, and stack depth, you can avoid these leaks and protect your stack throughout the tournament. Chapter 5: Flatting too much and 3-betting too little. Passive pre-flop decisions can lead to difficult post-flop situations and limit your ability to accumulate chips in tournament play. When players choose to call raises too often, instead of applying pressure with a re-raise, they create a range of hands that is capped and vulnerable. This approach often results in entering pots with hands that are not strong enough to withstand aggression on later streets, especially when facing opponents who are willing to continue betting. The consequence is a pattern of investing chips pre-flop and then being forced to fold on later streets, which steadily erodes your stack and leaves you with fewer opportunities to win uncontested pots. Flat calling, especially from positions like the cutoff against a hijack open, is a common leak for many players. When you simply call with hands such as ace of spades and jack of clubs, you signal to observant opponents that your range lacks the strongest hands, such as pocket queens or ace-queen suited, which you would typically re-raise. This capped range becomes apparent on flops like queen of spades, 7 of diamonds, and 4 of clubs, where your opponent can confidently continue betting, knowing you are unlikely to have the very top of your range. The problem intensifies when you flat call with speculative hands like king of diamonds and 3 of diamonds, or jack of hearts and 4 of hearts. The chance of flopping a flush draw with these suited hands is only about 11%, and even when you do, you risk running into stronger flushes, leading to costly mistakes. Furthermore, when you call pre-flop, you often find yourself in pots where the post-flop pot odds, such as 3-1 on a 2,500 chip bet into a 7,800 chip pot, require you to have at least 25% equity. With a capped range and no initiative, realizing this equity becomes challenging, and you are frequently forced to fold before reaching showdown. The alternative to excessive flatting is to incorporate more selective 3-betting into your pre-flop strategy. By choosing to re-raise with hands like ace of spades and jack of clubs against a standard hijack opening range, you immediately put pressure on your opponent. This action leverages fold equity, as many hands in the hijack's range, such as ace of spades and queen of spades, 9 of spades and 9 of hearts, or suited connectors, are not strong enough to continue against a sizable 3-bet. As a result, you often win the pot outright, without seeing a flop. Even when called, you isolate yourself against a narrower range and reduce the number of opponents, preserving your hand's equity. For example, 3-betting from the cutoff can maintain an equity advantage of around 64% against 3 random hands by thinning the field pre-flop. This isolation is especially valuable in tournaments, where accumulating chips without showdown is a key to long-term success. Taking the initiative with a 3-bet also simplifies post-flop play. When you are the aggressor, you can confidently make continuation bets on favorable boards, such as betting 3/4 of the pot on value-heavy textures to deny equity to drawing hands. This proactive approach defines both your range and your opponent's range more clearly, making your decisions on later streets more straightforward. In contrast, flat calling pre-flop often leads to ambiguous situations where you are forced to make tough decisions after investing chips, particularly when facing large bets on the turn or river. By 3-betting, you avoid these marginal spots and retain control of the hand's narrative. To illustrate the strategic difference between flatting and 3-betting, consider a hand played at 70 big blinds effective between the hijack and the cutoff. The hijack opens to 2.5 big blinds, representing a standard middle position range that includes hands like ace of spades and queen of spades, king of clubs and jack of clubs, 9 of spades and 9 of hearts, 7 of spades and 7 of diamonds, ace of clubs and 9 of clubs, queen of spades and jack of spades, and suited connectors down to 7 of spades and 6 of spades. The action folds to the cutoff, who holds ace of spades and jack of clubs. Instead of re-raising, the cutoff chooses to flat call. Both blinds fold, and the hand proceeds to the flop. The flop comes queen of spades, 7 of diamonds, and 4 of clubs. The hijack, holding the initiative, continues with a bet of 3.5 big blinds. The cutoff calls, entering the turn with only ace high and no draw. On the turn, the 2 of clubs appears. The hijack bets again, this time 7 big blinds. Facing continued aggression and holding only ace high, the cutoff folds and the hijack collects the pot uncontested. At each stage, the cutoff's decision to flat preflop with ace of spades and jack of clubs leaves them with a capped range and no initiative, making it difficult to defend against the hijack's pressure. The cutoff invests chips on the flop, but is forced to surrender on the turn, illustrating how excessive flatting leads to passive, unprofitable outcomes. This hand demonstrates the core issue with flatting too often and 3-betting too little. By not re-raising pre-flop, the cutoff gives up the chance to win the pot immediately, or to play heads-up with a defined range and initiative. Instead, the flat call creates a situation where the cutoff's range is transparent and vulnerable, allowing the hijack to apply pressure and force folds on later streets. The hijack wins the pot without ever having to show down a hand, while the cutoff loses chips without contesting the outcome. Constructing a balanced 3-bet range is essential to avoid these pitfalls and to protect yourself from exploitation. A well-built 3-bet range against a hijack open should include strong value hands such as ace of spades and queen of spades, 9 of spades and 9 of hearts, and 7 of spades and 7 of diamonds. To prevent opponents from adjusting too easily, it is also important to mix in bluffs like ace of clubs and 9 of clubs, queen of spades and jack of spades, and suited connectors down to 7 of spades and 6 of spades. This balance ensures that your 3 bets are not always for value, making it difficult for opponents to counter your strategy. From the cutoff, hands like ace of spades and jack of clubs are ideal candidates for a 3-bet due to their blocker effects and strong playability, while hands like king of diamonds and 3 of diamonds remain better as folds or occasional flats, given their poor performance post-flop. Maintaining balance also involves varying your post-flop actions. For example, you might bet 1/3 of the pot with some hands, check with others, and check raise with a third group. This approach keeps your opponents guessing about the strength of your range and prevents them from exploiting predictable patterns. The most effective 3-bet ranges from late position prioritize aces with strong kickers and pocket pairs of 7s and higher, while using suited Broadway cards as bluffs against middle position opens. By shifting your strategy away from excessive flatting and towards selective 3-betting, you gain the ability to win more pots uncontested, simplify your post-flop decisions, and protect your stack from slow erosion. This adjustment not only increases your fold equity and chip accumulation, but also makes you a more difficult opponent to play against, as your range remains uncapped and your actions unpredictable. The result is a more aggressive, balanced approach that maximizes your chances of success in tournament poker. Chapter 6. Overplaying one-pair hands. The strategic consequences of misjudging the true value of a single-pair hand can be severe, especially in tournament poker where chip preservation is paramount. One pair, whether it is top pair or an overpair, often feels strong in isolation, but its actual strength is highly dependent on the board texture and the number of opponents in the hand. On a dry board such as King, 7, 2 with no flush draws, a top pair hand can be a significant favorite when facing just one opponent, often holding a commanding advantage. However, as more players enter the pot, the likelihood that someone holds a set, 2 pair, or a strong draw increases sharply. In these multi-way scenarios, the equity of a top pair can drop substantially, sometimes to nearly half its original value. This is even more pronounced on coordinated or wet boards, where straight and flush draws are possible. For example, a board like 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 6 of diamonds presents numerous threats, and even a strong one-pair hand may only be a slight favorite heads-up and a clear underdog when facing multiple opponents. Overpairs, such as pocket queens on an ace-high board, can also lose much of their relative strength, especially when facing 2 or more opponents, whose ranges include top pair, sets, and strong draws. Even middle pairs on paired boards are vulnerable, as the presence of overpairs and trips in typical tournament ranges means these hands rarely retain more than moderate equity. Understanding how the value of one pair fluctuates with board texture and opponent count is essential to avoid overcommitting chips in unfavorable spots. Managing pot size with marginal made hands is a fundamental skill for tournament survival. When holding top pair with a weak kicker on a dry flop and playing with a stack of 50 big blinds, it is often wise to check back a significant portion of turn cards. This approach caps your range, signaling to opponents that you are not always strong, and preserves a healthy portion of your stack for later decisions. In position, when holding one pair on a coordinated board, a small continuation bet on the flop, around 1/3 of the pot, can be effective, but it is prudent to check the majority of turns and rivers. This strategy induces bluffs from opponents, while ensuring the pot remains manageable, typically under 1/3 of your stack. When out of position with an overpair on a wet board, the best course is often to check and call only small bets, folding to larger raises unless the pot odds are particularly favorable. This disciplined approach prevents you from being drawn into a large pot against a range that likely includes many hands that have you beat, or are drawing live. In multi-way pots, especially when effective stacks are around 40 big blinds, it is important to recognize that opponents' ranges are weighted towards sets and 2 pairs, which dominate one-pair hands. Slowing down in these situations by checking or calling small bets instead of betting aggressively can save a significant number of chips over the long run. Certain board runouts and betting patterns should serve as clear warning signs when holding only one pair. Turn cards that complete obvious draws, such as a third suited card, or a card that connects with a straight possibility, often signal a substantial loss in equity for top pair hands. In these spots, facing a large bet, especially one that is 2/3 of the pot or more, should prompt serious consideration of folding, as the likelihood that your hand is still best has dropped considerably. On the river, overcards or paired boards further reduce the strength of one pair, particularly against opponents who continue to bet strongly. In deep stacked pots, top pair is frequently dominated by better pairs or outdrawn by the river, especially on wet textures. Aggressive actions from opponents, such as a small check raise on a blank turn, often indicate a polarized range that includes many hands stronger than one pair. In these scenarios, the equity of a single pair hand can fall below 40%, making continued aggression or calls with one pair a costly mistake. To illustrate these concepts in practice, consider a hand played with 80 big blinds effective stacks. The action begins with a player in the hijack position, opening the betting to 2.5 big blinds. The cutoff, holding a strong but vulnerable hand, decides to 3-bet to 7 big blinds. The hijack calls, and the pot grows to 15 big blinds as the two players see the flop. The flop comes 8 of spades, 7 of spades, 6 of hearts, a highly coordinated board that offers straight and flush possibilities. The hijack checks, and the cutoff continues with a sizable bet of 10 big blinds. The hijack calls, bringing the pot to 35 big blinds as the turn is dealt. On the turn, the 9 of clubs appears, further connecting the board and introducing even more straight combinations. The hijack checks again, and the cutoff, still holding an overpair to the board, bets 25 big blinds. At this point, the hijack moves all in for 38 big blinds more. The cutoff calls, committing nearly their entire stack. The river brings the 2 of spades, completing the flush draw that was present on the flop. The hijack reveals Jack of spades and 10 of spades, showing that they held both a straight and flush draw on the turn, and have now completed a flush on the river. The cutoff's overpair is no longer best, and the hijack wins the pot. Throughout this hand, the cutoff's pocket queens represented an overpair to the board on the flop and turn. However, the board was highly coordinated from the outset, with multiple straight and flush draws possible. The hijack's range, which included suited connectors and suited Broadway cards, was well positioned to connect with this board. The cutoff's decision to bet large on both the flop and turn, and then call an all-in, demonstrates a classic case of overplaying a one-pair hand. The danger signs were present: a wet board, an opponent willing to continue through large bets, and a turn card that completed several draws. Rather than controlling the pot size or considering a check back, the cutoff treated the overpair as an automatic stack-off hand, ignoring the evolving board and the strength of the opponent's range. This approach resulted in a costly loss, as the hijack's drawing hand improved to a flush by the river. The outcome of this hand highlights the importance of evaluating one-pair hands in context. On coordinated boards, especially against opponents whose ranges include many drawing and made hands, the value of an overpair or top pair can diminish rapidly. Pot control, careful bet sizing, and attention to board texture are essential to avoid overcommitting with hands that are strong in isolation but vulnerable in practice. Recognizing when to slow down, check back, or fold can preserve your stack and prevent the most expensive mistakes in tournament play. By respecting the limitations of one-pair hands and adapting to the specific threats presented by the board and your opponents, you can make more disciplined and profitable decisions at the table. Chapter 7. Continuation: Betting on Bad Boards. When the community cards are highly coordinated and connect with the likely holdings of your opponents, the effectiveness of a post-flop bet drops sharply. The texture of the board is a critical factor in determining whether a continuation bet will achieve its intended goal of forcing folds and protecting your equity. On dry flops, such as those featuring an ace, a 10, and a deuce, or a jack, a 4, and a 3, the majority of pre-flop callers will have missed, leaving them with little more than unpaired overcards. In these situations, a well-timed continuation bet can often pick up the pot uncontested, as the range of hands that can continue is quite narrow. However, when the flop is coordinated, meaning the cards are close in rank and suited or connected, the dynamic shifts dramatically. Flops like Jack, 9, 7, or 9, 8, 6 are prime examples of boards that interact strongly with the hands that tend to call pre-flop raises, such as suited connectors and small pairs. These hands frequently connect with the board by making pairs, straight draws, or even two-pair and sets. As a result, the fold equity that a continuation bet relies on is greatly diminished, and the risk of running into resistance increases. To illustrate the contrast, consider the difference between betting into a board of ace, 10, and deuce versus a board of 9, 8, and 6. On the first, most opponents will have missed entirely, and a modest bet can force out hands like king, queen, or queen, jack. On the second, the likelihood that someone has connected with the board is much higher, as hands like 10, 9, 8, 7, or even suited connectors such as 9, 8, or 7, 6, are all possible holdings for callers. The more coordinated the board, the more likely it is that your opponents will have found a reason to continue, whether through a made hand or a strong draw. This is especially true on middle card boards, where the pre-flop raiser's typical holdings, big pairs and Broadway cards, are less likely to have improved, while the caller's ranges are filled with hands that thrive on these textures. When two cards on the flop are 9 or higher, the situation becomes polarized. Small bets may still push out missed high-card hands, but they also invite calls or raises from any opponent holding a piece of the board, especially if the board is suited or connected. The challenge becomes even more pronounced in multi-way pots. When facing two or more opponents, the probability that at least one player has connected with the flop increases significantly. In these scenarios, continuation betting as a bluff loses much of its power, as players at low to mid stakes are unlikely to fold marginal made hands or decent draws. The collective calling ranges in multi-way pots are wider, and often include hands specifically chosen for their ability to connect with coordinated boards. As the pre-flop raiser, your range advantage is diluted, and your ability to represent strong hands is undermined by the sheer number of possible combinations your opponents could hold. A single check from a player in the blinds or a caller can expose the pot to floats or aggressive check raises from anyone who has paired the board or picked up a draw. The mathematics of continuation betting in multi-way pots further reinforce the need for caution. When betting half the size of the pot, you generally need your opponents to fold at least 1 out of every 3 times for the play to break even. Against multiple players with ranges that have likely connected with a coordinated flop, achieving this fold rate is highly unlikely. As a result, continuation betting in these spots should be reserved for value-heavy hands, where you are comfortable facing resistance and can continue on later streets. Attempting to bluff in these situations is a recipe for burning chips and surrendering initiative, especially when your stack is deep and tournament survival is paramount. Preserving your stack in tournaments requires a disciplined approach to post-flop aggression. When you hold a weak or medium-strength hand on a wet board, checking back is often the superior choice. This allows you to realize your equity, avoid difficult decisions on later streets, and maintain your chip stack for more favorable situations. Selective aggression is the key to long-term success. On dry boards, continuation betting can maintain your initiative and apply pressure to opponents who have missed. On coordinated flops, however, checking prevents you from value-owning yourself against ranges that are unlikely to fold and often ahead. By controlling the pot size and delaying aggression to later streets, you can induce calls from weaker hands and keep the pot manageable against draws. This approach also preserves your fold equity for future streets, where changes in the board texture may allow you to represent strength more credibly and extract value or force folds when the situation is more favorable. Let's examine a practical example that highlights the dangers of automatic continuation betting on a coordinated board in a multi-way pot. Imagine a tournament scenario with effective stacks of 50 big blinds. The player under the gun opens the action with a raise to just over 2 big blinds. The middle position calls, followed by the button, who is known to play a wide range of hands from late position, including suited connectors, suited aces, Broadway cards, and small pairs. Both blinds fold, leaving 3 players to see the flop. The flop comes down 9 of spades, 8 of spades, and 7 of hearts. This is a highly coordinated board, offering numerous straight and flush draw possibilities, as well as plenty of potential for two-pair or sets. The under-the-gun player, holding ace of clubs and king of spades, decides to make a continuation bet of 5 big blinds into a pot of 7.5 big blinds. The middle position folds, but the button quickly raises to 14 big blinds. Facing this aggression on such a dangerous board, the under-the-gun player is forced to fold, and the button collects the pot without further contest. After the pre-flop action, the under-the-gun player's hand, ace-king offsuit, is a strong starting hand, but has not improved on the flop. On the board of 9, 8 and 7, with 2 spades, ace-king holds only high card value and no draw. The continuation bet is made into 2 opponents on a board that heavily favors the caller's ranges. The button's raise puts immediate pressure on the pre-flop raiser, who must fold a premium hand with no equity to continue. The button wins the pot without showdown. This hand demonstrates the strategic consequences of continuation, betting on a board that is unfavorable for the pre-flop raiser. The coordinated flop is much more likely to have improved the ranges of the callers, especially the button, who can easily have connected with pairs, draws, or even made straights. The continuation bet, made out of habit rather than careful consideration of board texture and opponent tendencies, quickly backfires. The under-the-gun player is forced to surrender a significant portion of their stack and the initiative in the hand, all without seeing another card. Had the pre-flop raiser checked instead, they could have controlled the pot size, gathered information about their opponent's holdings, and preserved their chips for a better opportunity. The lesson here is clear. In tournament poker, especially with deep stacks, it is essential to adjust your continuation betting strategy based on the board and the number of opponents. Automatic aggression on coordinated or multi-way boards is a costly mistake. By exercising selective aggression and checking back on dangerous flops, you protect your stack, avoid difficult spots, and set yourself up for long-term success. Recognizing when your fold equity is compromised and adapting your strategy accordingly is a hallmark of advanced tournament play. Chapter 8. Bluffing in the wrong spots. Bluffing in situations where opponents are unlikely to fold leads to unnecessary chip loss and undermines long-term profitability. Understanding when not to bluff is just as important as knowing when to apply pressure, especially in the context of small to mid-stakes Texas Hold'em tournaments. Many players at these levels fall into the trap of overestimating their ability to force folds, particularly against opponents who are predisposed to call. Recognizing these dynamics is essential for developing a disciplined and effective tournament strategy. One of the most important skills is the ability to identify players who rarely fold, often referred to as calling stations. These opponents are characterized by their tendency to enter too many pots before the flop, frequently limping or calling raisers with a wide variety of hands. Their approach is loose and passive, meaning they prefer to see flops and continue with marginal holdings rather than taking aggressive actions. After the flop, calling stations are known for their high willingness to reach showdown, even with weak pairs or draws. They seldom fold to continuation bets, regardless of the board texture or the size of the bet. In practical terms, this means that bluffs against such players are rarely effective, as their inclination to call overrides logical hand reading or fear of strong holdings. In small stakes tournaments, these tendencies are especially prevalent, and the statistics reflect this. Players fitting this profile often have a high percentage of hands played voluntarily, a high rate of reaching showdown, and a low rate of folding to 3-bets before the flop. Post-flop, they frequently check and call with marginal hands, rarely folding to pressure or attempting to bluff themselves. Their own bets tend to be small, further signaling their passive nature. Against these players, attempting to bluff is a low percentage play, as their calling frequency remains high regardless of your perceived strength or the story you are trying to tell. Another critical aspect of avoiding unsuccessful bluffs is understanding how certain board textures interact with your opponent's likely range. Some boards, often described as range-heavy, connect much more strongly with the hands that a caller is likely to hold. For example, low and connected boards such as Queen of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, and 7 of Spades are dangerous to bluff into when facing a player who called from the blinds or limped in from early position. These boards allow for a wide variety of draws and made hands, including pairs, straight draws, and flush draws, all of which are commonly found in the calling station's range. Monotone boards, where all cards are of the same suit, or paired low boards, such as 8 of Hearts, 10 of Spades, and 7 of Spades followed by the 5 of Clubs, also favor the caller's range. Players who call pre-flop from early or middle position, with hands like small pairs, suited connectors, and suited aces, are more likely to connect with these textures. When the turn or river brings cards that complete potential straights or flushes, such as an 8 of Hearts or a 3rd spade, the likelihood that the caller has improved increases significantly. In these spots, calling stations are known to continue with hands like Queen 5 suited or King 10, even when the board becomes increasingly coordinated. Attempting to bluff on these runouts is rarely successful, as the opponent's range is both wide and well connected to the board. To illustrate the dangers of bluffing in the wrong spots, consider a hand played with 40 big blinds, effective between the cutoff and the big blind. The player in the cutoff opens the action with a standard raise, and the big blind, known for defending with a wide range that includes suited connectors, suited aces, Broadway cards, and many offsuit hands, makes the call. The flop comes 8 of Spades, 6 of Spades, and 5 of Clubs. The big blind checks, and the cutoff makes a continuation bet of 2.5 big blinds. The big blind calls, and the action proceeds to the turn. At this point, the board adds the 2 of Hearts. The big blind checks again, and the cutoff increases the pressure with a bet of 6 big blinds. Once more, the big blind calls. The river brings the 2 of Spades, pairing the board and completing the flush draw. The big blind checks for a 3rd time, and the cutoff, holding Ace of Diamonds and Queen of Clubs, decides to attempt a bluff with a bet of 12 big blinds. The big blind calls and reveals 9 of Spades and 7 of Spades, making a flush. The cutoff's ace high is no match, and the big blind wins the pot. Examining the hand street by street, the cutoff's continuation bet on the flop is standard, especially given the overcard strength of ace-queen. After the flop action, the cutoff holds only ace high, with no direct draw, while the big blind's range remains wide and includes many hands that connect with the board. On the turn, the cutoff's second barrel is ambitious, as the 2 of Hearts does little to change the board texture or reduce the likelihood that the big blind has a strong draw or made hand. After the turn action, the cutoff still holds only ace high, with no improvement. When the river brings the 2 of Spades, the board now contains 3 spades and is paired, making it highly likely that any flush or trips will call a bet. The cutoff's decision to bluff in this spot is a strategic error, as the big blind's range contains many suited spade combinations that have now made a flush. The big blind's call with 9 of Spades and 7 of Spades demonstrates the futility of bluffing in this situation. The outcome reinforces the importance of recognizing when an opponent's range is strong and unlikely to fold, especially after calling multiple bets on a coordinated board. This example highlights a common mistake, attempting to bluff into a player who has shown no interest in folding and on a board that heavily favors their range. In small and mid-stakes tournaments, players are less likely to fold strong hands, particularly flushes or trips, even in the face of large bets, The correct adjustment in these situations is to exercise discipline and check back the river, preserving chips rather than risking them on a low-success bluff. The calling station's tendency to call with any flush or trips, regardless of bet size, makes bluffing a losing proposition. Developing discipline over creativity is crucial for long-term success in these fields. While it can be tempting to try to outplay opponents with elaborate bluffs, the reality is that selective aggression yields better results. Against calling stations, value betting with strong hands is far more profitable than attempting to force folds. In fact, value bets can be sized larger than usual, sometimes up to twice the size of the pot, because these players call with inelastic ranges. Bluffing, on the other hand, fails due to the lack of fold equity. The most effective approach is to isolate these players pre-flop with hands that dominate their range, such as pocket eights or better, and Broadway cards, and then value bet relentlessly post-flop when holding strong hands. When holding marginal hands or facing scary board textures, checking back or folding is often the higher expected value play, as calling stations are quick to call with improved bluff catchers when pot odds are favorable. Ultimately, the key to exploiting loose passive opponents is to recognize their refusal to fold and adjust your strategy accordingly. By focusing on value and exercising restraint with bluffs, you can avoid costly mistakes and maximize your edge in small and mid-stakes tournaments. The discipline to pass on low-percentage bluffs and wait for profitable spots is what separates consistently winning players from those who struggle to build their stacks. Chapter 9. Missing thin value bets. Extracting additional profit from marginal made hands is a critical skill that separates consistently winning players from those who leave chips on the table. When facing opponents who are prone to call with a wide range of hands, the ability to recognize and execute thin value bets on the river becomes a primary driver of long-term success. In tournament settings with buy-ins ranging from $10 to $150, the dynamics of river play shift in favor of those who can identify spots where a small bet with a modest hand will be called by worse holdings, often enough to make the play profitable. The essence of a thin value bet lies in wagering with a hand that is only slightly ahead of the likely calling range, aiming to secure a small but meaningful edge rather than to protect against draws, which by the river have already failed to improve. A thin value bet is most often made with hands such as top pair with a weak kicker, second pair on a dry board, or a medium pair that blocks possible straights. These are not premium holdings, but in the right context, they are strong enough to extract value from opponents who are reluctant to fold pairs or other showdown-worthy hands. For example, when holding top pair with a weak kicker on a board where the action suggests the opponent is unlikely to have a stronger hand, a small river bet can induce calls from worse pairs or even ace-high hands. The profitability of these bets hinges on the expectation that, when called, the bettor will win just over half the time. This slim margin, repeated consistently, accumulates into a significant advantage over the course of many hands. Sizing is a crucial component of thin value betting. In these tournament environments, smaller bet sizes, typically between 1/3 and 2/3 of the pot, are most effective. This approach encourages calls from the widest range of weaker hands without risking unnecessary chips against stronger holdings. By keeping the bet size modest, the bettor avoids pushing opponents off marginal hands that would otherwise call, and also limits losses in the rare cases where the opponent holds a better hand. The goal is to strike a balance between maximizing value from worse hands and minimizing the risk of being value-owned by stronger ones. The tendencies of small and mid-stakes opponents further reinforce the value of thin betting. Many recreational players at these levels display a strong inclination to call down with hands, such as top pair, second pair, or even unraised two pair, especially when the betting line suggests that the bettor could be bluffing or betting thinly. These players are far less likely to bluff raise on the river, preferring instead to see a showdown with their marginal holdings. As a result, the risk of being pushed off a winning hand by a bluff is relatively low, and the opportunity to extract value from hands that would otherwise check down is high. Showdown frequencies in these games tend to be elevated, with opponents often calling river bets with a range that includes not only top pair but also second pair, third pair, and missed draws that have some residual showdown value. This willingness to call with marginal hands creates an environment where thin value bets are particularly lucrative. The calling ranges in these spots are typically weighted toward hands that are just below the better's value range, making it possible to profit with hands that would be considered too weak to bet in tougher games or against more aggressive opponents. It is important, however, to adjust thin value betting strategies based on the specific tendencies of the opponent. Against players who are known to call with almost any pair, or who rarely raise without a very strong hand, thin value betting should be a regular part of the river strategy. Conversely, when facing opponents who are capable of bluff raising, or who fold marginal hands more frequently, it may be prudent to check back or use even smaller sizing to avoid being exploited. The key is to recognize the elasticity of the opponent's calling range, and to tailor the approach accordingly. Constructing an effective river value betting range involves careful consideration of both the better's hand and the likely calling range of the opponent. The hands that should be included in a thin value betting range are those that beat a meaningful portion of the opponent's expected calls, typically just over half. This often includes top pair with a weak kicker, medium pairs that block potential straights, and two-pair combinations that are unlikely to be dominated given the board and prior action. For example, on a river where a straight draw has missed, the bettor can profitably wager with hands that are ahead of the opponent's likely calls, such as top pair with a weak kicker or a medium pair, knowing that the opponent will often call with worse pairs or missed draws. The mathematics of thin value betting can be illustrated with a simple pot odds calculation. When making a river bet of a certain size into the pot, the opponent needs to call with a frequency that makes the bet break even, or better for the bettor. For instance, a bet of 5 big blinds into a pot of 15 requires the opponent to call at least 1/4 of the time for the bet to be profitable. By choosing a sizing that keeps the opponent's marginal hands in the calling range, the bettor ensures that thin value remains a positive expectation play. To see these concepts in action, consider a hand played with 55 big blinds effective between the button and the hijack in a typical tournament. The hijack, representing a standard middle position range that includes suited Broadway cards, suited aces, medium pocket pairs, and suited connectors, opens the action with a raise to 2.5 big blinds. The button calls, and both players proceed to the flop. At this stage, the specific holdings of the button are not yet revealed, but the context is set for a common small stakes confrontation. On the flop, which comes Jack of diamonds, 7 of clubs, and 4 of spades, the hijack checks. The button responds with a bet of 3 big blinds, and the hijack calls. After this action, the button holds top pair with a weak kicker, a classic candidate for a thin value bet in this situation. The turn brings the 2 of hearts, and both players check, indicating that neither is eager to build a large pot without a stronger hand. The river is the 8 of hearts, completing the board with no flush or straight possibilities that would dramatically shift the hand strengths. On the river, the hijack checks once more. The button now chooses to bet 5 big blinds, a sizing that targets calls from second pair, third pair, or other marginal hands that populate the hijack's range. The hijack calls, revealing a pair of 8s, second pair on this board. The button's top pair with a weak kicker holds up, and the pot is awarded to the button. This hand demonstrates the power of thin value betting in small stakes tournaments. By recognizing that the opponent's range contains many hands that will call a modest river bet, but are still behind, the button is able to extract additional chips that would have been lost by simply checking back. The hijack's willingness to call with second pair is typical of the calling tendencies found at these stakes, and the absence of a bluff raise threat makes the thin value bet a clear choice. Over time, consistently making these bets with marginal but ahead hands generates a steady stream of profit, capitalizing on the tendencies of opponents to call too wide and bluff too infrequently. Mastering thin value betting on the river requires both technical understanding and a keen awareness of opponent behavior. By constructing value betting ranges that include hands just strong enough to beat the majority of expected calls, and by sizing bets to encourage calls from weaker holdings, players can systematically exploit the calling patterns prevalent in small and mid-stakes tournaments. This approach not only increases immediate winnings, but also builds a foundation for long-term success as the competition becomes more challenging. Chapter 10. Chasing draws with poor odds. Making repeated calls with weak drawing hands can steadily erode a tournament stack, especially when the odds do not justify the risk. The strategic consequences of chasing low-equity draws are often underestimated, yet these decisions can undermine a player's ability to survive and apply pressure in later stages. To avoid this pitfall, it is essential to understand the nature of different draws, how to calculate the odds involved, and when the situation simply does not warrant a call. Drawing hands in poker come in various forms, each with its own potential and risk. A flush draw, for example, occurs when a player holds two cards of the same suit, and the board provides two more, leaving one card needed to complete the flush. This type of draw offers 9 outs, which means there are 9 cards remaining in the deck that can complete the hand. On the flop, a flush draw has about a 35% chance to improve by the river, making it a relatively strong drawing hand. An open-ended straight draw is another favorable situation, where a player needs one of 2 ranks to complete a straight, resulting in 8 outs and roughly a 17% chance to hit on the next card. In contrast, a gut-shot straight draw is much weaker. It requires one specific card to complete the straight, providing only 4 outs and about an 8.5% chance to improve on the turn. Understanding the difference between these draws is crucial, as the strength of the draw directly influences whether a call is justified. Pot odds are the foundation for evaluating whether to continue with a drawing hand. Pot odds represent the ratio of the current pot size to the size of the bet you must call. For instance, if the pot is 10 big blinds and the bet is 4 big blinds, the pot odds are 10-4, or 2.5-1. To break even on this call, a player would need at least 28.5% equity, which is far more than a gut shot provides. Implied odds add another layer to this calculation, accounting for the additional chips a player expects to win if the draw completes. With deep stacks, such as 80 big blinds effective, implied odds can sometimes justify chasing strong draws like flushes, as there is potential to win a large pot if the hand comes in. However, for weak draws like gut shots, the implied odds are rarely sufficient. Even if the straight is made, opponents with strong ranges are unlikely to pay off large bets, and there is always the risk of running into a higher straight or flush, especially with bottom-end draws. The risks of chasing draws become even more pronounced in multi-way pots and deep stack situations. When several players are involved, the equity of drawing hands drops sharply. For example, a flush draw that holds 35% equity heads up may fall below 25% against 3 opponents, as there are more ways for someone else to have a stronger hand or draw. In these scenarios, the pot may be larger, but the required equity to justify a call also rises, since the likelihood of being outdrawn or facing a stronger made hand increases. Deep stacks further complicate matters. With 80 big blinds behind, calling large bets with weak draws can quickly lead to significant losses. The potential reward is often an illusion, as opponents with strong ranges are less likely to pay off big bets when the draw completes, and the risk of losing a large portion of your stack is very real. In tournament play, where survival and stack preservation are paramount, these mistakes can be especially costly. To illustrate these concepts, consider a hand played in a deep stack tournament, with 80 big blinds effective. The action begins with a player in the hijack seat, representing a standard middle position range that includes hands like ace of spades with queen of spades, king of spades with jack of spades, pocket nines, pocket sevens, jack of clubs with 10 of clubs, and suited connectors, down to 7 of spades with 6 of spades. The hijack opens the betting to 2.5 big blinds. Sitting on the button, the hero calls, and both blinds fold, leaving the pot at 6.5 big blinds as they go to the flop. The flop comes 9 of clubs, 6 of diamonds, and 2 of spades. The hijack continues with a bet of 4 big blinds. The hero, holding 8 of spades and 7 of spades, calls. At this point, the hero has a gutshot straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. The gutshot requires a 5 to complete the straight, which means there are only 4 cards in the deck that can help. The backdoor flush draw would require 2 running spades, a much less likely outcome. The hero's hand is weak, with only a small chance to improve on the next card. The turn brings the 3 of hearts. The hijack bets again, this time for 10 big blinds. The hero calls once more, still holding only a gutshot straight draw. The hand has not improved, and the odds of hitting the straight remain at about 8.5%. The pot odds offered by the turn bet do not justify a call with such a low chance of success, especially given the strength of the hijack's range and the depth of the stacks. The river is the queen of diamonds. The hijack bets 20 big blinds, and the hero folds. The hijack wins the pot, uncontested. Throughout this hand, the hero made 2 calls with a weak draw, risking a significant portion of their stack for a low probability outcome. The implied odds were not favorable, as the hijack's strong range and willingness to bet multiple streets made it unlikely the hero would be paid off even if the straight came in. By calling twice, the hero committed nearly a quarter of their stack, chasing a draw that was unlikely to materialize, and even less likely to be profitable if it did. This example highlights the dangers of overcalling with weak draws in deep stack tournament settings. The hero's repeated calls with only a gutshot and a backdoor flush draw were not supported by the pot odds or the implied odds. The hijack's range was strong, and the bets were sized in a way that required far more equity than the hero's hand could provide. As a result, the hero lost a substantial portion of their stack without ever reaching showdown, reducing their ability to apply pressure or survive deeper into the tournament. Recognizing and avoiding this type of mistake is essential for long-term success. Habitually calling with weak draws like gutshots can steadily drain a stack, turning a healthy 80 big blinds into a short stack over the course of several orbits. The cumulative effect of these small errors is often more damaging than a single large mistake. To prevent this, it is important to follow a disciplined approach when evaluating drawing situations. First, calculate the number of outs and the corresponding equity. Next, assess the pot odds and consider whether implied odds are truly present, especially in deep stack or multi-way pots. Then factor in the number of opponents and the strength of their ranges. Finally, if the required equity to call exceeds what the draw provides, the correct play is to fold. By consistently applying this process, players can avoid the trap of chasing draws with poor odds and preserve their stack for more favorable opportunities. The discipline to fold weak draws even when the temptation to get there is strong, separates successful tournament players from those who slowly bleed chips. Over time, these disciplined decisions add up, allowing a player to maintain a healthy stack and maximize their chances of deep runs and final table appearances. Chapter 11. Playing short stacks like deep stacks. When playing with a stack of 15 to 20 big blinds, the range of profitable strategies narrows dramatically. At this depth, the ability to apply pressure across multiple streets is almost entirely removed, and the majority of hands are best played through decisive pre-flop actions. The limited stack size means that speculative hands, such as suited connectors or small pocket pairs, lose much of their value because there is not enough behind to realize implied odds or extract significant value when they hit. In tournament settings, these stack sizes are common, especially as blinds increase and antes accumulate. Players often find themselves in late position with an opportunity to open the action, but the correct approach shifts from nuanced post-flop play to a more disciplined push-or-fold mentality. The focus becomes maximizing fold equity and leveraging the threat of elimination to force mistakes from opponents, rather than attempting to outmaneuver them after the flop. Effective stack depth is a critical concept here. With only 15 to 20 big blinds, the room for creative lines is gone. Early position play must tighten up, as opening with marginal hands and hoping to navigate post-flop is rarely profitable. Conversely, in late position such as the button or cutoff ranges should widen, and the emphasis should be on identifying hands that are strong enough to shove for maximum fold equity. For example, opening to around twice the big blind from late position can pressure the blinds, but with a short stack, it is often better to move all in directly with hands like small pocket pairs or most ace highs. This approach capitalizes on the fold equity available and avoids the pitfalls of being left with a shallow stack after a failed post-flop maneuver. The inefficiency of post-flop maneuvering at these depths becomes clear when considering the math behind calling pre-flop. When a player calls a raise with a 15 to 20 big blind stack, they are typically left with only 12 to 18 big blinds behind. This remaining stack is too small to apply meaningful pressure on later streets, and the opportunity to realize implied odds is effectively eliminated. Hands that rely on hitting the turn or river to become profitable, such as suited connectors or small pairs, are particularly poor choices for passive play at this depth. The potential payoff is simply not there, and the risk of being forced to fold after missing the flop is high. Passive lines, such as flatting pre-flop and checking down, convert valuable fold equity into lost expected value. When the effective stacks are shallow, the best way to maximize value is to force opponents to make difficult decisions for all their chips before the flop. By shoving, a player can win the pot outright without seeing a flop, or at least ensure that their hand realizes its full equity in an all-in confrontation. Calling and playing post-flop, on the other hand, often leads to awkward situations where the player is pot-committed with a marginal hand or forced to fold after investing a significant portion of their stack. To illustrate these concepts, consider a typical tournament scenario with 17 big blinds effective. The action begins with a player in the cutoff, holding a wide late position range that includes hands such as ace of clubs with 9 of clubs, king of spades with queen of diamonds, jack of spades with 10 of spades, 6 of spades with 6 of hearts, 4 of spades with 4 of clubs, and suited connectors down to 8 of spades with 7 of spades. The cutoff opens the action to 2 2/10 big blinds. On the button, the next player faces a decision with ace of spades and jack of diamonds. The blinds fold, and the pot now stands at 6 4/10 big blinds. Instead of moving all in, the player on the button chooses to flat call. This leaves them with only 14 8/10 big blinds behind. The flop comes 9 of spades, 5 of clubs, and 2 of hearts. The cutoff continues with a bet of 3 big blinds, and the button calls once again. At this point, the button holds only ace high, which is a weak-made hand on this board. The turn brings the 7 of clubs. The cutoff checks, and the button checks behind. The river is the queen of spades. The cutoff now bets 6 big blinds, and the button folds. The cutoff wins the pot uncontested. Throughout this hand, the consequences of passive play with a short stack are evident. By flat calling pre-flop with a strong but vulnerable hand, the button wastes the opportunity to leverage fold equity against the cutoff's wide range. After the flop, the remaining stack is too shallow to apply pressure or comfortably commit, yet too large to justify a desperate call with only ace high. The passive line results in a difficult post-flop spot, where the player cannot extract value or force a fold, and ultimately must surrender the pot. The cutoff, with a wide range, is able to win without ever facing a significant decision for their stack. This example highlights a common mistake among tournament players who fail to adjust to the realities of short stack play. The correct approach with 17 big blinds and a hand like ace of spades with jack of diamonds is to shove pre-flop. By doing so, the player maximizes fold equity, potentially forcing the cutoff to fold many weaker hands that would otherwise see a cheap flop. Even when called, ace-jack performs well against the cutoff's wide opening range, and the all-in move simplifies the decision-making process. There is no room for subtlety or slow play at this depth. The stack size dictates a binary choice between shoving and folding. Adopting a disciplined shove or fold framework is essential when playing with 15 to 20 big blinds. The key is to evaluate whether an all-in shove has enough equity against the opponent's likely calling range to be profitable, and to use position to adjust the range of hands that are suitable for this play. Good shove spots often arise in late position, particularly on the button or cutoff, where the blinds may be tight and the risk of running into a premium hand is lower. Hands such as strong ace highs, medium pairs, and many suited aces or pairs are ideal candidates for shoving, as they perform well in all-in confrontations and benefit from the fold equity generated by the threat of elimination. It is important to avoid flat calling with hands whose primary value comes from post-flop playability. When facing a raise with a short stack, the choice should be between shoving with hands that have reasonable all-in equity or folding if the hand is likely to be dominated. Hesitation, such as min-raising or flatting instead of shoving, often surrenders fold equity and creates awkward post-flop spots, where committing becomes difficult and expected value is lower than the pre-flop shove alternative. The discipline to make clear, decisive pre-flop decisions is what separates successful short-stack players from those who consistently bleed chips in marginal spots. Understanding the limitations and opportunities of short-stack play is crucial for tournament success. By recognizing when to shift from post-flop maneuvering to a push or fold strategy, players can avoid the traps that come from treating a shallow stack as if it were deep. The ability to maximize fold equity, simplify decisions, and extract value from strong hands is the foundation of effective short-stack play. When the stack is short, every chip matters, and the discipline to act decisively is the key to survival and advancement in tournament poker. Chapter 12. Misplaying medium stacks at 25 to 40 big blinds. Mismanaging a stack between 25 and 40 big blinds in a tournament often leads to missed opportunities for aggression and increased vulnerability to post-flop pressure. At this depth, the stack-to-pot ratio after a single raise typically falls between 2 and 6, which means that post-flop decisions are shaped less by deep multi-street maneuvering and more by immediate equity and the potential to force folds. Unlike deep stacks where speculative hands can be played for implied odds, medium stacks demand a focus on hands that retain strong showdown value or can realize equity quickly. This is because the remaining chips are significant enough to threaten an opponent with an all-in, but not so deep that you can comfortably navigate several streets with marginal holdings. The pressure points in tournament play shift at these stack sizes. Both opening and facing raises can quickly turn into situations where you must decide whether to commit your entire stack or fold, rather than simply calling and seeing more cards. Understanding the unique dynamics of medium stacks is crucial for tournament survival. The average stack size in the middle stages of most tournaments often falls within this range, which means that a large portion of your decisions will be made with these constraints. When you enter a pot with a medium stack, you retain enough chips to make your opponent think twice about calling a shove, but you also risk becoming pot committed with a hand that is not strong enough to continue. This is why hand selection becomes more critical. High pocket pairs, strong ace combinations, and Broadway hands that can make top pair with a good kicker are preferred. These hands can win at showdown or apply pressure pre-flop, whereas speculative hands like low-suited connectors lose much of their value because there is not enough depth to realize their potential. One of the most common pitfalls at this stack depth is excessive flat calling, especially from out of position. When you flat call a raise with a medium stack, you often create a higher stack-to-pot ratio than if you had 3-bet or shoved. This can lead to awkward situations where you are forced to commit a large portion of your stack with a marginal hand, simply because the pot has grown too large relative to your remaining chips. Flat calling also caps your range, signaling to observant opponents that you likely do not have premium hands. This allows them to apply pressure on later streets, knowing that you are less likely to have the strongest holdings. The result is that you can be forced off your equity, or end up calling down with hands that are not strong enough to win at showdown. At 25 to 40 big blinds, pre-flop ranges should actually tighten for opening and widen for 3-bet or shove decisions. Many hands that are profitable as a 3-bet or shove, such as strong broadways and medium pocket pairs, lose value when played as flats, especially out of position. By flatting, you surrender the chance to win the pot outright and allow dominated or marginal hands to see a flop. This is particularly dangerous in multi-way pots, where you need a much stronger hand to commit chips on later streets. Avoiding flat calls with speculative hands like low-suited connectors or weak offsuit broadways is essential, as these hands rarely make strong enough hands to justify committing your stack in a high-pressure post-flop environment. To illustrate the dangers of passive play with a medium stack, consider a hand played at 32 big blinds effective between the button and the hijack. The hijack, holding a standard middle position opening range that includes hands like ace-jack offsuit or better, king-queen offsuit, pocket sevens or higher, suited broadways, and some suited connectors, opens the action with a raise to just over 2 big blinds. The action folds to the button, who holds ace of spades and jack of spades. Instead of applying pressure, the button chooses to flat call. Both blinds fold, and the pot going to the flop is just over 6 big blinds. The flop comes 8 of diamonds, 4 of clubs, and 2 of spades. The hijack continuation bets 2.5 big blinds, and the button calls. At this point, the button holds only ace-high with 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw, but no immediate made hand or strong draw. The turn brings the 9 of hearts. The hijack bets 6 big blinds, and the button calls again. Now the button still has only ace-high, with no meaningful draw and no improvement in hand strength. The river is the 6 of clubs. The hijack checks, and the button checks behind. The hijack reveals 9 of clubs and 9 of spades for a set, winning the pot. This sequence demonstrates how flat calling pre-flop with a hand like ace-jack, suited at 32 big blinds, can create an awkward stack-to-pot ratio and limit your ability to apply pressure. By not 3-bet jamming pre-flop, The button allows the hijack to realize equity with a hand like pocket nines and play perfectly post-flop. The button is then forced to call down with a marginal holding, losing more chips than necessary. If the button had chosen to 3-bet jam pre-flop, the hijack would have faced a difficult decision with pocket nines, and the button would have maximized fold equity, potentially winning the pot outright, or at least avoiding a tough post-flop scenario. This hand highlights how passive play with medium stacks can result in being trapped and losing significant value. The strategic value of 3-bet jamming with a medium stack lies in the ability to convert fold equity into immediate chip gains. When you shove for your entire stack in this range, you force your opponent to make a binary decision, call and risk a significant portion of their stack, or fold and concede the pot. Many hands that are profitable to open or call with are not strong enough to call a shove, especially when the effective stack is between 25 and 40 big blinds. This means that by jamming you can win the pot, uncontested, a significant percentage of the time. The best hands to use for 3-bet jams are those that perform well in all-in situations and block your opponent's strongest holdings. Strong ace combinations, high pocket pairs, and some suited broadways are ideal candidates. Pure bluff shoves should be used more sparingly than at shorter stack depths, as the risk of being called is higher. Position and opponent tendencies play a crucial role in determining when to 3-bet jam. Against loose openers, you can expand your jamming range, especially when you have position, because their opening range is wider and they are more likely to fold marginal hands. Against very tight openers or deep stacks, you should tighten your jamming requirements, as these players are more likely to call with strong hands and realize their equity. Understanding your opponent's tendencies allows you to tailor your aggression and maximize your fold equity. Adjusting to your opponents is essential when playing a medium stack. Versus tight openers, you can widen your isolation and 3-bet jam range because their opening range is narrower, increasing the likelihood that they will fold to aggression. Against loose openers, it is better to 3-bet shove with hands that have good showdown value, rather than flatting, as flatting allows them to realize their equity and puts you in difficult post-flop spots. When opponents call frequently from the big blind or in position with medium stacks, avoid creating high stack-to-pot ratios out of position. Instead, apply pressure pre-flop with a 3-bet or shove, or fold marginal holdings to prevent being forced to play for your stack on later streets. Adjust your opening sizes and ranges based on the positions and stack sizes of the players behind you. If there are medium stacks in position who call opens often, consider using smaller open sizes or 3-bet jamming when you have position. If medium stacks are behind you, tighten your opening range to avoid being forced into difficult decisions for your tournament life. Mastering medium stack play requires a willingness to be decisive and aggressive when the situation demands it. By understanding the dynamics of stack-to-pot ratios, avoiding excessive flat calling, and using 3-bet jams to maximize fold equity, you can avoid the traps that claim so many tournament lives at this depth. Adjusting to your opponents and stack sizes at the table ensures that you are always applying the right kind of pressure, protecting your stack, and giving yourself the best chance to advance deep into the tournament. Chapter 13: Ignoring ICM and Bubble Pressure. Failing to account for the unique value of tournament chips during critical payout thresholds leads to costly errors that can erase hours of careful play. In tournament poker, the value of each chip is not constant, but instead depends on the distribution of stacks and the payout structure. The Independent Chip Model, or ICM, is the framework that translates chip stacks into real money equity, reflecting how much each player's stack is worth in terms of potential prize pool share. This model becomes especially important as the tournament approaches the bubble, the point at which one more elimination guarantees all remaining players a minimum payout. At this stage, the pressure to survive intensifies, and the value of simply folding and outlasting shorter stacks can far exceed the value of accumulating a few extra chips. The closer the field gets to the payout threshold, the more pronounced this effect becomes. For example, when 19 players remain and only 18 will be paid, the risk of busting before the bubble bursts can outweigh the potential reward of a marginal chip gain. As a result, optimal strategy shifts dramatically, and understanding these dynamics is essential for maximizing long-term tournament profit. One of the most common mistakes players make near the bubble is becoming overly cautious, folding far too many hands out of fear of elimination. While survival is indeed more valuable at this stage, there are also significant opportunities for chip accumulation if you recognize how ICM pressure affects your opponents. Big stacks in particular can take advantage of this dynamic by widening their opening ranges, especially when they have more than 20 big blinds. With medium stacks under 15 big blinds, feeling the squeeze of the bubble, big stacks can profitably shove a much wider selection of hands from late position, knowing that their opponents will fold more often to preserve their chance of reaching the money. For example, a big stack might shove with more than 20% of hands from the cutoff or button, exploiting the fact that medium stacks are incentivized to avoid marginal confrontations. Conversely, medium stacks facing late position opens must carefully balance their own ranges. While calling ranges tighten, shoving as a defense can remain profitable, with blocker-heavy hands such as King-Queen or Queen-Jack, especially when holding 10 to 15 big blinds. In some cases, aggressive reshoves, with 8 to 12 big blinds, become the best play, particularly when the bubble factor, an ICM measure of survival value, rises above 2. This means that the value of surviving is more than double the value of gaining chips. So hands that block strong holdings and have reasonable equity can be used to pressure opponents who are opening wide. The key is to recognize when your opponents are folding too much, and to seize those opportunities rather than letting the bubble paralyze your game. On the other hand, some players fall into the opposite trap, calling all-ins too lightly near the bubble and failing to appreciate the true cost of busting before the money. ICM dictates that the risk of elimination is far more damaging to your equity than a simple chip calculation would suggest. For instance, even if an opponent is shoving 80% of hands, you need at least 64% equity to justify a call near the bubble, compared to a much lower threshold in a cash game or early tournament stage. This means that hands like King-Queen offsuit, which might seem like easy calls against a loose range, actually lose money in the long run, when ICM is taken into account. The penalty for busting before a payout jump is so severe that only the strongest hands should be used to call off your stack. For medium stacks facing a big stack, shove at 15 big blinds. Effective, only the top 20% of hands, such as pocket nines or better, ace-king suited through ace-jack suited, and ace-king offsuit through ace-10 offsuit, are strong enough to overcome the survival penalty imposed by ICM. Even in situations where the small blind shoves all in with 10 big blinds, the big blind must fold hands that would be profitable in chip EV terms, only calling with hands that have at least 36% equity under high bubble pressure. These adjustments are not intuitive, but they are essential for avoiding costly mistakes that can end your tournament prematurely. To illustrate the consequences of ignoring ICM and bubble pressure, consider a hand played with 28 big blinds effective between the cutoff and the big blind. The cutoff, holding a wide late position range that includes most Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors, and small pairs, opens the action with a raise to just over 2 big blinds. Action folds to the big blind, who is sitting on 28 big blinds, and is acutely aware that only 2 players need to bust before everyone is guaranteed a payout. Without revealing the big blind's hand just yet, it is important to note that the cutoff's range is wide, but not reckless, and the big blind stack is healthy enough to survive the bubble with prudent play. The big blind responds by moving all in, shoving for the full 28 big blinds. The cutoff quickly calls and tables a pair of kings, specifically the king of spades and king of hearts. The flop comes 7 of diamonds, 5 of clubs, and 2 of hearts. After the flop action, the big blind holds only an ace-high hand, with no pair or significant draw. The turn brings the 4 of spades, and the river completes the board with the queen of diamonds. The big blind's hand, revealed as ace of clubs and 9 of spades, remains unimproved, while the cutoff's kings hold up to win the pot. The big blind is eliminated just 2 spots from the money. This hand demonstrates a critical misstep. The big blind's decision to shove all in with ace-9 offsuit ignores the immense value of survival at this stage of the tournament. With 2 players left to bust before the money, the risk of elimination far outweighs the potential chip gain from forcing a fold or winning a flip. The cutoff's wide opening range does not justify risking the tournament life with a marginal hand, especially when a call or even a fold would preserve the stack for a better opportunity. By failing to adjust for ICM and bubble pressure, the big blind sacrifices a significant amount of equity, turning a potentially profitable tournament into a costly exit. The cutoff, by contrast, benefits from the big blind's mistake, securing a valuable pot and increasing the likelihood of a deep run. To consistently capitalize on ICM dynamics, it is essential to make practical adjustments that exploit the tendencies of other players near the bubble. When facing medium stacks who are playing too tightly, big stacks should raise between 25 and 35% of hands from the button or cutoff when holding more than 20 big blinds. This strategy leverages the fact that ICM forces medium stacks to fold over 70% of their defendable hands before the bubble bursts. Conversely, when opponents are calling too loosely and ignoring ICM, it is important to tighten your shoving range to only the top 10% of hands, such as pocket queens or better, and ace-king, especially from stacks of 12 big blinds. This approach preserves your own equity while maximizing fold equity against tables that are otherwise too tight. If you find yourself with a big stack of over 40 big blinds near the bubble, you can profitably steal blinds every 2 to 3 orbits with a range that includes 40% of hands, such as suited broadways, since opponents are unlikely to call without premium holdings. Additionally, when a short stack at the table has fewer than 5 big blinds, reshoving with 15 to 25% of hands that contain blockers, such as suited aces, king-queen suited or better, and pocket eights or higher, over big stack opens, can increase your chances of moving up the payout ladder if the short stack busts first. Mastering ICM and bubble pressure is not just about survival, it is about recognizing when to apply pressure and when to avoid unnecessary risk. By understanding how chip value changes near critical payout thresholds, you can avoid the pitfalls of over-tightening or calling off too lightly, and instead make decisions that maximize your long-term tournament equity. The players who consistently adjust their strategy to account for ICM are the ones who find themselves deep in tournaments, capitalizing on the mistakes of those who do not. Chapter 14. Treating late registration lightly. Entering a tournament after the initial levels have passed can dramatically alter the strategic landscape, often compressing stack sizes and intensifying the skill level of the remaining field. When players join during the late registration period, they typically receive a starting stack worth between 20 and 30 big blinds, depending on the tournament's blind structure and how far the event has progressed. This compressed stack depth means that the luxury of slow speculative play is gone. Instead, every decision carries greater weight, and the margin for error shrinks considerably. The composition of the field also shifts during this phase. Many recreational players, who are more likely to make costly mistakes, have already been eliminated. What remains is a pool increasingly populated by experienced regulars who understand the nuances of short stack play and are adept at exploiting any sign of weakness. Late registration, therefore, is not simply a convenience, it is a strategic inflection point that demands careful consideration. The existence of late registration is not arbitrary. It serves several purposes within tournament poker. For organizers, it increases prize pools and accommodates players with scheduling constraints. For players, it offers a unique opportunity to enter with a stack whose independent chip model value has already increased, sometimes by 5 to 10%, simply because a significant portion of the field has been eliminated. By skipping the early levels, a late entrant avoids the variance of deep stack confrontations and can immediately play for a share of the remaining prize pool with a stack that is, in relative terms, worth more than the original buy-in. However, this benefit comes with a trade-off. The stack-to-pot ratio is much shallower, which simplifies some decisions but also restricts the range of hands that can be profitably played. In these situations, the optimal approach is to tighten pre-flop ranges, often folding all but the strongest hands such as pocket kings or better, to preserve the increased equity and avoid unnecessary risk. Despite these advantages, many players treat late registration as an afterthought, entering tournaments without adequate preparation or strategic adjustment. This casual approach introduces a host of pitfalls. Players who register late without a plan often find themselves with stacks between 5 and 20 big blinds, immediately thrust into high-variance situations that require precise push-fold decision-making. The lack of familiarity with the table and absence of player history further complicate matters. When several skilled players late register at the same time, they are often seated together, creating a dynamic where aggression and bluffing are more frequent, and mistakes are punished swiftly. Fatigue can also play a significant role, especially in multi-flight events that run late into the night. Entering a tournament while tired reduces focus and increases the likelihood of errors, particularly during the transition from deeper to shallower stacks around the 20 big blind mark. A common mistake among casual late registrants is misjudging the impact of ICM, or independent chip model shifts. At stack depths of 20 big blinds, defending the big blind too widely against standard raises can be costly, especially when optimal solver-based ranges recommend much tighter play. Without the benefit of accumulated reads or a clear understanding of the table's tendencies, players are more likely to make suboptimal decisions, such as calling off with marginal hands or overestimating their fold equity in spots where opponents are unlikely to relinquish strong holdings. The result is often a quick exit from the tournament, wasting both the buy-in and the opportunity to capitalize on the increased equity that late registration can provide. To illustrate the consequences of treating late registration lightly, consider a hand where a player enters a tournament during the late registration period with a stack of 25 big blinds. The player is seated on the button, while the opponent is in the hijack position. The hijack, representing a standard middle position range that includes suited Broadway cards, suited aces, and medium pocket pairs, opens the action with a raise to 3 times the big blind. The player on the button, having just sat down and feeling rushed, decides to call with Queen of Spades and Jack of Spades. At this point, the player has not taken the time to assess the table dynamics or consider the implications of playing a marginal hand with a shallow stack. The flop comes 8 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, and 2 of spades. The hijack continuation bets half the pot, and the button calls. After this action, the player on the button holds only 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw, which is a weak-made hand with limited potential. The turn brings the 4 of hearts. The hijack now bets 2/3 of the pot, and the button calls again. At this stage, the player still has just 2 overcards and no meaningful draw, yet continues to invest chips without a clear plan. The river is the 9 of clubs. The hijack moves all in, and the button calls off the remaining stack. The opponent reveals ace of spades and 8 of spades for top pair, securing the pot and eliminating the button from the tournament immediately after late registration. This hand exemplifies the dangers of entering a tournament without proper preparation or discipline. The player on the button failed to recognize the importance of stack depth and table composition, overvaluing a marginal hand and making a series of calls that were not supported by hand strength or board texture. The rushed pre-flop call set the stage for further mistakes, as the player continued to call down with a weak holding against a standard range from the hijack. The lack of adjustment to the shallow stack size and the failure to tighten up pre-flop ranges led directly to an early bust-out, wasting the opportunity to leverage the increased equity that comes with late registration. To avoid these pitfalls, it is essential to approach late registration as a deliberate strategic decision, rather than a matter of convenience. The first step is to evaluate the potential return on investment by comparing the value of a starting stack near the money bubble to the opportunities available during the early levels with deeper stacks. If a player has a significant skill edge over the field, it may be more profitable to register early and maximize the number of hands played at 100 big blind depths. Conversely, players who specialize in short stack play and are comfortable with push-fold charts may find late registration more appealing, provided they are prepared for the increased variance and tougher field. Seat selection becomes particularly important after late registration. Avoiding tables with large chip leaders or clusters of skilled regulars can make a significant difference in survival and chip accumulation. A disciplined approach also means using ICM-aware ranges from the very first hand, rather than relying solely on chip EV calculations. This adjustment compounds expected value over time, especially in fields where the remaining players are more experienced and aggressive. Before entering late, players should ensure their bankroll can withstand the increased variance associated with short stacks, ideally maintaining a cushion of 2 to 3 times the standard buy-in. Familiarity with push-fold charts for stack sizes between 10 and 30 big blinds is crucial, as these situations arise frequently and require quick, accurate decisions. By treating late registration as a strategic choice and preparing accordingly, players can maximize their edge and avoid the costly mistakes that come from entering tournaments unprepared or on impulse. Ultimately, the key to successful late registration lies in recognizing its unique challenges and opportunities. By understanding the changes in field composition, stack dynamics, and optimal ranges, and by preparing both mentally and technically before sitting down, players can turn late entry into a source of long-term profit rather than a liability. The difference between a disciplined, strategic approach and a casual, rushed entry is often the difference between building a deep run and making an early, avoidable exit. Chapter 15. Failing to adjust to calling stations. Failing to adapt strategy against players who consistently call bets with weak hands leads to significant missed value and unnecessary losses in tournament poker. When facing opponents who rarely fold, it becomes essential to recognize their tendencies and adjust both value betting and bluffing frequencies accordingly. Many players overlook these adjustments, allowing calling stations to realize their equity far too often, and missing opportunities to extract maximum chips from hands that would otherwise be highly profitable. The first step is learning to identify calling stations at the table. These players are characterized by their frequent calls, regardless of hand strength, and their reluctance to raise or fold. In tournament settings, especially during periods when the risk of elimination is low, such as rebuy phases, calling stations are even more prevalent. They tend to play a wide range of hands, entering pots with marginal holdings and continuing through multiple streets with little regard for the strength of their own cards or the aggression shown by their opponents. Statistically, Calling stations display high voluntary put money in pot percentages, often exceeding 40%, while their pre-flop raise rates remain low, sometimes under 10%. This combination of loose and passive play results in a pattern where they call bets on the flop, turn, and river, with hands that most players would have folded much earlier. Observing a player who consistently calls down with weak pairs or even high card hands, especially in the face of large bets, is a clear indicator of this playing style. Once a calling station has been identified, the next adjustment is to widen the range of hands used for value betting. Against these opponents, it is profitable to bet for value with hands that might be considered too thin against tighter players. For example, second pair or even third pair can often be bet for value, as calling stations will pay off with worse. The key is understanding that their calling range is inelastic. They are just as likely to call a large bet as a small one, with the same weak hand. This allows for increased bet sizing, particularly on the turn and river, where overbets up to twice the size of the pot can be effective with strong holdings. The goal is to maximize the number of chips won from hands that would otherwise be difficult to extract value from. Thin value bets become a core part of the strategy, as these players will often call with hands like bottom pair or ace high, providing consistent returns for those willing to press their advantage. To illustrate these concepts, consider a hand played with 40 big blinds, effective between the cutoff and the big blind. The opponent in the big blind is a classic calling station, defending with a wide range that includes suited trash, offsuit connectors, and most Broadway cards. The action begins with a standard open from the cutoff to 2.2 big blinds, which the big blind calls. The flop comes queen of spades, 7 of diamonds, and 4 of clubs. The big blind checks, and the cutoff bets 2.5 big blinds. The big blind calls, continuing with a wide and weak range. At this point, the cutoff holds king of hearts and queen of clubs, giving them top pair with a strong kicker on a relatively dry board. On the turn, the 2 of spades falls. The big blind checks again, and the cutoff increases the pressure with a bet of 6 big blinds. The big blind calls once more, demonstrating the tendency to continue with hands that are often dominated or drawing thin. After the turn action, the cutoff still holds top pair with a strong kicker, and the board remains uncoordinated, offering few draws for the big blind to credibly represent. The river brings the 9 of hearts. The big blind checks for a third time. Recognizing the opponent's unwillingness to fold, the cutoff bets 15 big blinds for value. The big blind calls and reveals queen of diamonds and 5 of spades, showing a weaker top pair with a poor kicker. The cutoff's king-queen wins the pot, having extracted maximum value across all 3 streets from a player who would not fold a weaker hand. This hand demonstrates the importance of adjusting value betting strategy against calling stations. By betting all 3 streets with top pair and a strong kicker, and by increasing bet sizes on the turn and river, the cutoff capitalizes on the big blind's tendency to call with inferior hands. The decision to value bet thinly and size up bets is directly tied to the opponent's inelastic calling range. Against a more disciplined player, such aggressive value betting might risk running into stronger hands or forcing folds from worse, but against a calling station, it is the optimal approach. Equally important is the need to reduce bluff frequency when facing these opponents. Bluffing relies on the ability to force folds from hands that cannot call a bet. Against calling stations, this fundamental premise breaks down. These players call wide regardless of board texture, bet size, or perceived range advantage. Even when holding blockers to the nuts or representing a strong range, bluffs lose their effectiveness because the opponent simply does not fold often enough. In low-stakes tournaments, this tendency is even more pronounced, with calling stations showing a strong aversion to folding on any street. As a result, the expected value of bluffs drops sharply, while value bets become even more profitable. The most effective strategy against calling stations is to focus on value and minimize bluffs. By identifying these players early and adjusting accordingly, it becomes possible to exploit their tendencies for consistent profit. Widening value betting ranges, increasing bet sizes, and targeting thin value all contribute to maximizing returns. At the same time, reducing or eliminating bluffs prevents unnecessary chip loss in spots where fold equity is low. This disciplined approach not only accumulates chips efficiently, but also avoids the frustration of watching strong hands go unpaid or bluffs get called down by marginal holdings. In tournament poker, the ability to recognize and exploit calling stations is a crucial skill. Players who fail to make these adjustments leave significant value on the table and risk being outperformed by those who do. By focusing on value and tailoring bet sizing to the opponent's tendencies, it is possible to turn a common table dynamic into a steady source of profit. Chapter 16. Giving too much credit to tight lines. When facing opponents who consistently act with caution and restraint, the implications for your decision-making are profound. Players who display a pattern of selective aggression, especially from early positions, are often signaling that their bets are anchored in genuine hand strength rather than speculative bluffs. Recognizing these patterns is essential for avoiding costly mistakes, particularly in tournament settings where every chip is valuable. A tight player's line is typically characterized by a conservative pre-flop approach, followed by measured bets or checks on the flop and turn, and then a decisive, often larger bet on the river. This sequence is rarely a sign of creative bluffing. Instead, it reflects a range that is heavily weighted towards strong made hands. When you encounter this kind of betting pattern, especially from an early position raiser, your default assumption should be that their river aggression is value-driven. This is even more pronounced when the river bet is large relative to the pot, as tight early position players tend to reserve such sizing for their strongest holdings. To understand why this matters, consider how betting patterns and bet sizes interact with player tendencies. In tournaments with buy-ins ranging from $10 to $150, the majority of tight players do not deviate far from straightforward strategies. Their river bets, particularly when they represent a significant portion of the pot or more, are seldom bluffs. The logic is simple. The larger the bet, the more equity you need to justify a call. Against a player whose range is already strong due to their early position and tight pre-flop selection, the likelihood that they are bluffing enough to make your call profitable is low. For example, if you are facing a river bet that offers you 2-to-1 pot odds, the mathematics dictate that your opponent must be bluffing more than 1/3 of the time for your call to break even. In practice, tight early position players in small to mid-stakes tournaments rarely reach this threshold. Their river aggression is more often a reflection of a completed value hand than a missed draw or a creative bluff. This tendency is supported by observed showdown rates and river bluff percentages in these environments. Tight players, particularly those opening from early positions, tend to reach the river with a range that is already strong and becomes even more value-heavy as the hand progresses. Their willingness to bet all three streets is usually reserved for hands that can withstand scrutiny at showdown. As a result, many players make the mistake of calling too wide on the river, giving too much credit to the possibility of a bluff. The reality is that in these spots, the proportion of bluffs is much lower than one might hope. This is especially true when the board run-out does not favor missed draws, or when the river completes obvious value combinations that fit the tight player's pre-flop range. Let's examine a practical example that illustrates these concepts in action. Imagine a tournament hand with effective stacks of 45 big blinds. The action begins with a player in early position, specifically under the gun +1, opening the betting to 2.2 big blinds. This player is known for a tight, value-oriented range, typically including premium pairs and strong Broadway combinations. The action folds around to the button, who calls, while both blinds release their hands. At this stage, the button is aware that the early position opener's range is composed of hands like pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks, ace-king suited, and ace-queen suited. The flop comes down 7 of clubs, 9 of spades, and queen of diamonds. The early position player continues with a bet of 3.5 big blinds, and the button calls. After the flop action, the button holds top pair with a weak kicker, a hand that is respectable but not dominant, given the opponent's tight range. The turn brings the 2 of hearts. The early position player bets again, this time for 7 big blinds. The button calls once more. At this point, the button's hand remains top pair with a weak kicker, but the board has not changed significantly in terms of potential draws or improved hands. The early position player's continued aggression on the turn further narrows their range towards strong value hands, as tight players are unlikely to double barrel with air or marginal holdings in this spot. The river is the 3 of clubs, completing a run-out that is dry and unlikely to have improved many drawing hands. The early position player now fires a substantial bet of 18 big blinds into a pot of 26.4 big blinds. Faced with this large river bet, the button must decide whether to call with top pair and a weak kicker, or to fold. In this scenario, the button chooses to fold, and the early position player collects the pot without showdown. This decision exemplifies disciplined play, rooted in a clear understanding of opponent tendencies and betting patterns. The button recognizes that the early position player's line, opening from a tight range, betting all 3 streets and sizing up on the river, almost always represents a strong value hand. In small to mid-stakes tournaments, especially against tight early position opponents, the frequency of triple barrel bluffs is extremely low. Calling with top pair and a weak kicker in this spot would require the early position player to be bluffing far more often than is realistic for this player type and situation. By folding, the button preserves their stack for future opportunities, avoiding a call that is unlikely to be profitable in the long run. The strategic lesson here is that folding strong but non-premium hands against tight river aggression is not a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of sound tournament strategy. When the opponent's range is heavily weighted toward value, and your hand's equity does not meet the threshold required by the pot odds, folding is the correct play. This approach not only protects your stack, but also maintains your ability to apply pressure and leverage in later hands. In tournament poker, survival and the preservation of fold equity are often more valuable than making a speculative call in a spot where you are rarely ahead. By internalizing these principles, you can avoid the common pitfall of giving too much credit to potential bluffs from tight opponents. Instead, focus on the evidence presented by their betting patterns, position, and range construction. When the facts point to a value-heavy line, exercise the discipline to fold even hands that might seem strong in a vacuum. This mindset will help you navigate tough river decisions and protect your tournament life, giving you the best chance to capitalize on more favorable situations as the event progresses. Chapter 17. Not exploiting over tight play, near ladders. When players become excessively cautious as tournament pay jumps approach, they create a window for more assertive opponents to accumulate chips without needing premium hands. This dynamic is especially pronounced near final table bubbles or significant payout increases, where the fear of busting before a short stack leads many medium stacks to fold hands they would otherwise play. Understanding how to recognize and exploit this tendency is crucial for maximizing your tournament equity, as it allows you to win pots uncontested and build a stack while others are paralyzed by risk aversion. The first step in capitalizing on this situation is learning to identify laddering behavior at your table. Laddering is the practice of folding marginal or even strong hands in order to survive longer than other players and move up the payout structure. This is most common when the next pay jump is significant and there are short stacks at the table. Medium stacks, typically in the range of 20 to 25 big blinds, are particularly susceptible to this pressure. They recognize that busting before a short stack would mean missing out on a valuable pay jump, so they tighten their calling and defending ranges, often folding hands that would be standard calls or raises in less pressured situations. You can spot this behavior by observing repeated folds from these players in late position, especially when they pass up opportunities to defend their blinds or call small raises with hands like pocket eights or ace-jack suited. Tournament payout structures reinforce this tendency, as the difference between finishing, for example, 9th and 8th can be substantial, leading to even more conservative play as the final table approaches. Once you have identified opponents who are playing too tightly near ladders, the next adjustment is to widen your own opening and jamming ranges, particularly from late position. Against these over-tight players, it is profitable to open as many as 40 to 50% of hands when effective stacks are between 15 and 25 big blinds. The key is to target medium stacks who are under the most pressure to avoid elimination before the short stacks. These players are often willing to fold hands that would otherwise be strong enough to continue, simply to preserve their tournament life and secure the next pay jump. In practical terms, this means you can profitably raise or shove with a much wider range, including suited connectors, small pairs, and blocker hands like ace-x suited. In tournaments with buy-ins ranging from $10 to $150, this approach is especially effective, as players at these stakes tend to be more risk-averse near ladders. Position is critical here. Being on the button or cutoff allows you to apply maximum pressure, as the blinds are often the most likely to fold in order to avoid ICM disaster. When short stacks are present, you can further widen your jamming range, as the medium stacks behind you will be even less likely to risk their tournament life with marginal holdings. Aggression and positional awareness become far more valuable than waiting for premium hands in these situations. The traditional approach of waiting for pocket queens or better is less effective when your opponents are folding so frequently. Instead, opening with a range of 30 to 40% from late position allows you to steal pots of 2.5 to 3 big blinds without resistance. Blocker hands like ace-10 offsuit or king-jack offsuit are particularly effective, as they reduce the likelihood that your opponents hold strong hands themselves. Additionally, you can exploit the tendency of medium stacks to fold hands like pocket eights or ace-jack suited by raise shoving over their opens with a wider range, knowing that their calling range has tightened to only the top 10 to 12% of hands. This approach not only accumulates chips but also denies your opponents the opportunity to realize their equity, further increasing your advantage. To illustrate how this strategy works in practice, consider a hand played at a table with effective stacks of 28 big blinds. The player in the hijack is a medium stack who has been playing noticeably tight as a significant pay jump approaches. Their range in this spot is limited to strong hands, such as pocket nines or better, ace-queen suited or higher, and king-queen suited, while folding most suited connectors and medium pairs. The action folds to the cutoff, who recognizes the hijack's overly cautious approach and decides to open with 8-7 suited. The blinds are yet to act, but the focus is on the hijack, who tanks for a moment before folding. The blinds also fold, and the cutoff wins the pot without contest. At the moment of the raise, the cutoff is not relying on the strength of 8-7 suited as a made hand. Instead, the decision is based on the understanding that the hijack is unlikely to defend with anything but the very top of their range, due to the pressure of the looming pay jump and the presence of shorter stacks at the table. The cutoff's hand is a suited connector, which has some post-flop playability if called, but the primary goal is to win the pot pre-flop by leveraging the hijack's risk aversion. When the hijack folds, the cutoff strategy is validated, as the pot is secured without needing to see a flop or risk further chips. This hand demonstrates the power of applying pressure rather than waiting for premium holdings near ladders. By recognizing the hijack's tendency to fold too often in these spots, the cutoff is able to accumulate chips without showdown, steadily increasing their stack while others are focused solely on survival. The key takeaway is that exploiting overtight play near pay jumps requires a shift in mindset. Instead of fearing elimination, you should be looking for opportunities to take advantage of your opponent's fear. By widening your opening and jamming ranges, especially from late position, and targeting medium stacks who are most affected by ICM pressure, you can consistently win uncontested pots and build a stack that positions you for a deep run. The strategic consequence of this approach is clear. While others are content to fold their way up the payout ladder, you are actively increasing your tournament equity by accumulating chips at every opportunity. This not only gives you a better chance of reaching the top payouts, but also allows you to dictate the pace of play as the field narrows. The ability to recognize and exploit laddering behavior is a hallmark of advanced tournament strategy, and mastering it will set you apart from players who are content to let the blinds erode their stacks in the hope of moving up one more spot. By focusing on pressure rather than premiums, you turn the fear of others into your own advantage, steadily building a stack while your opponents wait for hands that may never come. Chapter 18: Poor Bankroll Management for Tournament Variance. Entering multi-table tournaments without careful attention to one's available funds can lead to rapid and irreversible losses, even for skilled players. The structure of these events creates a unique environment where variance is far more pronounced than in cash games. In a typical tournament, each player pays a fixed entry fee and receives a set starting stack, but only a small fraction of the field will ultimately receive a payout. This payout structure is top-heavy, meaning that the majority of the prize pool is reserved for those who finish near the top. As a result, most participants will leave empty-handed, regardless of how well they play in any single event. In tournaments with buy-ins ranging from $10 to $150, field sizes can range from 100 to more than 2,600 players. Despite the wide range of skill levels present, the frequency with which any individual player finishes in the money remains low, often below 15%. This means that even a strong player will fail to cash in the vast majority of tournaments entered, simply due to the nature of the structure. The impact of this variance becomes clear when considering the likelihood and duration of downswings. In a field of around 1,200 players, it is entirely possible to experience a losing streak that lasts for 125 tournaments or more, even when playing with a significant skill edge. These downswings are not the result of poor play, but rather the statistical reality of independent tournament outcomes. Each event is a separate trial, and the probability of running into a series of unfavorable results is much higher than many players expect. This is in stark contrast to cash games, where players can rebuy at any time, and the payout structure is linear, allowing for more consistent results and less severe swings. In tournaments, the elimination format and the need to survive multiple blind levels before reaching the money make it essential to prepare for extended periods without a payout. Given the heightened variance in tournaments, it is crucial to adopt disciplined bankroll management tailored to this environment. Professional guidelines recommend maintaining a bankroll of at least 100 buy-ins for standard multi-table tournaments with up to 1,000 players. For events with larger fields, such as those exceeding 1,000 entrants, the recommendation increases to 200 buy-ins. This approach ensures that no single tournament entry represents more than 1 or 2% of the total bankroll, providing a buffer against the inevitable swings. For example, a player who wishes to participate in $10 buy-in tournaments should have between $1,000 and $2,000 set aside exclusively for tournament entries. For $50 events, the recommended bankroll rises to $5,000 to $10,000, and for $150 tournaments, the prudent range is $15,000 to $30,000. These figures are not arbitrary. They are designed to allow a player to withstand long stretches without a cash, and to avoid the psychological pressure that comes from risking too much of one's funds on any single event. It is also important to adjust these guidelines based on expected return and field size. Players with a lower expected return on investment, or those entering tournaments with especially large fields, should consider increasing their bankroll requirements even further. The larger the field, the more difficult it becomes to reach the top payout positions, and the greater the risk of extended downswings. By keeping each entry to a small fraction of the total bankroll, players can approach each tournament with a clear mind, free from the anxiety that comes with risking more than they can afford to lose. When players ignore these guidelines and play above their bankroll, the consequences are often severe and multifaceted. Risking more than 2 to 5% of one's total funds on a single tournament entry dramatically increases the likelihood of going broke during a downswing. As the bankroll shrinks, the pressure to recover losses mounts, leading to emotional decisions and a departure from sound strategy. Players may find themselves making desperate moves, such as shoving all in with weak hands or marginal holdings, simply to avoid being blinded out or to chase a quick double-up. This tendency is especially pronounced when a player's stack falls below 20 big blinds, at which point the temptation to gamble with a wide range of hands becomes difficult to resist. The loss of fold equity and the unfavorable pot odds that result from such plays only compound the problem, making it even harder to recover. Emotional tilt is another common consequence of poor bankroll management. After a series of bust-outs, players may become frustrated or anxious, leading to suboptimal bet sizing and poor decision-making. For example, a player might call off their stack with a marginal hand, simply because the pot odds appear attractive, without fully considering the strength of their opponent's range or the long-term expected value of the call. In some cases, depleted funds may prompt a player to take shots at higher stakes tournaments without the recommended 25 to 30 buy-ins, further exposing themselves to variance and increasing the risk of ruin. A practical example illustrates how inadequate bankroll management can undermine even a reasonable tournament strategy. Imagine a player entering a $100 tournament with only $500 available for poker. The effective stack depth at the table is 40 big blinds. The action begins with a player in the cutoff, who opens the betting to 2.2 big blinds. The cutoff's range is wide, typical for late position, and includes most Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors, and small pairs. The player on the button, holding a pair of sevens, faces a decision. Instead of making a standard call or a small 3-bet, the button shoves all in for 40 big blinds. The blinds fold, and the cutoff calls the all-in bet. At this point, the board is revealed one street at a time. The flop comes with a 2 of spades, a 9 of hearts, and a queen of diamonds. The turn brings the 4 of clubs, and the river completes the board with the 3 of spades. At showdown, the cutoff reveals queen of spades and jack of spades, making a pair of queens. The button shows 7 of clubs and 7 of diamonds, holding only a pair of sevens. The cutoff wins the pot with top pair, while the button is eliminated. Examining the hand from the button's perspective, the decision to shove 40 big blinds over a standard open, with a medium pocket pair, is a high variance play that is not justified against a wide but not reckless cutoff range. The underlying motivation for this move is rooted in the player's bankroll situation. Entering a $100 tournament with only $500 creates a sense of urgency to double up early and make it count, as the player cannot afford to grind patiently through the tournament's natural swings. This fear of busting and the desire to avoid a slow elimination lead to a decision that ignores the principles of sound tournament strategy. Instead of preserving chips and waiting for a better spot, the player takes an unnecessary risk, hoping for a quick payoff. This example highlights the direct connection between poor bankroll management and suboptimal play. When players feel financial pressure, they are more likely to make desperate moves that increase variance and reduce their long-term chances of success. Proper bankroll discipline allows players to approach each tournament with patience and confidence, knowing that a single bust-out will not threaten their ability to continue playing. By maintaining a sufficient bankroll and respecting the realities of tournament variance, players can avoid the emotional traps that lead to costly mistakes and give themselves the best possible chance to succeed over the long run. Chapter 19. Letting emotion drive decisions. Allowing emotional reactions to override strategic thinking in tournaments can quickly turn a manageable setback into a costly disaster. When frustration or anger takes the reins, even experienced players may find themselves making decisions that contradict their best judgment. This phenomenon, often referred to as tilt, is not simply a fleeting mood, but a powerful psychological state that can reshape the course of an entire session. Understanding how these emotional triggers arise and recognizing their impact is essential for anyone seeking consistent tournament success. Emotional triggers in poker tournaments are both common and varied, often emerging in the wake of particularly painful outcomes. One of the most familiar is the bad beat, where a strong hand is outdrawn by a weaker one in a dramatic fashion. These moments can feel deeply unfair, especially when the odds were in your favor until the final card. Coolers, where two strong hands collide and one is destined to lose, can also provoke a surge of frustration. The bubble phase of a tournament, when only a few players remain before the money is reached, is another notorious source of emotional upheaval. Here, the pressure of missing out on a payout after hours of play can amplify every decision and magnify the sting of elimination. Emotional responses to these situations can manifest in several ways. Some players experience angry tilt, marked by visible outbursts or aggressive play. Others retreat into silent tilt, becoming withdrawn and detached from the action. There is also a form of sad tilt, where a sense of doom or resignation takes over, sapping motivation and focus. Even losing to less experienced opponents or being repeatedly outmaneuvered can provoke these emotional states, as the mind struggles to reconcile the gap between expectation and reality. These triggers are not rare, they are woven into the fabric of tournament poker, and nearly every player encounters them at some point. The consequences of letting emotion dictate play are both immediate and far-reaching. When tilt sets in, logical decision-making is often the first casualty. Players may find themselves making reckless bluffs, chasing pots with weak hands, or calling down with marginal holdings simply to prove a point or recoup losses. A common mistake is overplaying hands like ace-queen or pocket tens, inflating their value in situations where caution would be wiser. Frustration can also lead to deviations from standard strategy, as players manufacture justifications for questionable calls or folds. Fear may drive a player to fold a strong hand prematurely, while anger might prompt a call with little regard for the actual odds. Emotional play frequently results in poor positional awareness, with players ignoring the importance of acting last or failing to account for aggressive opponents yet to act. Table dynamics are overlooked, and the subtle cues that inform sound strategy are drowned out by the noise of internal turmoil. In deep tournament stages, this can lead to punting away large stacks in a single hand, often due to panic or a desperate attempt to regain control. Stress impairs the ability to adjust to rising blinds or shifting table compositions, and minor opponent behaviors are sometimes overvalued, leading to misreads and further mistakes. The cumulative effect is a sharp decline in win rate, as the quality of decisions deteriorates and the risk of elimination increases. To illustrate how unchecked emotion can sabotage tournament performance, consider a hand played at 30 big blinds effective between the cutoff and the hijack. The hijack, holding a standard middle position range that includes suited broadways, suited aces, medium pairs, and suited connectors, opens the action with a raise to 2.5 big blinds. The cutoff, still reeling from a recent bad beat, responds not with measured analysis, but with a surge of frustration. Instead of evaluating hand strength and position, the cutoff aggressively 3-bets to 7 big blinds. The hijack calls, and the hand proceeds to the flop. The board comes 2 of diamonds, 7 of spades, and 9 of diamonds. The hijack checks, and the cutoff, still driven by emotion rather than logic, fires a continuation bet of 10 big blinds. The hijack calls again, and the turn brings the 4 of spades. After another check from the hijack, the cutoff shoves the remaining 13 big blinds as a bluff. The hijack calls, and the river completes the board with the queen of clubs. At showdown, the hijack reveals a pair of 9s, having flopped a set, while the cutoff shows ace of clubs and 5 of clubs, holding only ace high throughout the hand. The hijack wins the pot with a strong made hand, while the cutoff stack is decimated by a series of decisions rooted in emotional upheaval rather than strategic reasoning. Examining the hand street by street reveals the pitfalls of emotional play. Pre-flop, the cutoff's 3-bet, with ace-5 suited, is overly aggressive against a strong opening range from the hijack, especially at 30 big blinds effective. The flop brings a low and coordinated board, and after the hijack checks, the cutoff's continuation bet with only ace-high is ambitious. There is no draw or significant equity to justify such a large bet, yet the emotional residue from the previous hand clouds judgment. On the turn, with the board showing 2 of diamonds, 7 of spades, 9 of diamonds, and 4 of spades, the cutoff's decision to shove is a clear overextension. There is no draw, no pair, and no realistic chance to improve. The hijack's call is straightforward with a set of 9s, and the river does nothing to alter the outcome. The cutoff stack is lost not to variance or a cooler, but to a sequence of choices made under the influence of tilt. This hand underscores how emotion can lead to overplaying weak holdings, ignoring opponent ranges, and compounding losses instead of recovering from them. Emotional discipline, in this scenario, would have preserved chips and allowed for a more measured comeback. Developing emotional control is not an optional extra for tournament players. It is a core skill that underpins long-term success. Practical techniques for maintaining composure begin with simple but effective routines. Deep breathing can help reset the mind after a tough hand, while positive visualization reinforces confidence and focus. Channeling frustration discreetly, rather than displaying it at the table, prevents opponents from exploiting visible distress. Recognizing emotions as natural signals, rather than threats to be suppressed, allows players to assess their source and respond constructively. Sometimes the best course of action is to take a short break, stepping away from the table to regain perspective and composure. Building discipline involves shifting attention from gut feelings to observable patterns and probabilities, ensuring that decisions remain grounded in logic rather than impulse. When mistakes do occur, it is important to put them in perspective, avoid dwelling on regret, and focus on the next hand with renewed clarity. Professionals who excel at emotional control consistently outperform their peers, not because they avoid setbacks, but because they recover quickly and maintain a high standard of play regardless of circumstance. Their ability to stay composed under pressure translates directly into better results, deeper runs, and more frequent cashes. Ultimately, the ability to recognize emotional triggers, understand their impact on decision-making, and implement strategies for emotional regulation is what separates resilient tournament players from those who are derailed by adversity. Emotional discipline is not just a mental game accessory. It is a fundamental component of tournament strategy that safeguards both your stack and your long-term edge. By cultivating awareness and practicing composure, you can ensure that every decision at the table is driven by logic and skill, not by the fleeting turbulence of emotion. Chapter 20. Not paying attention when out of the hand. Failing to observe the action when not directly involved in a hand leads to missed opportunities for strategic advantage. Poker is a game of incomplete information, and every hand played at the table is a chance to gather data about your opponents. By watching the hands you are not participating in, you can collect valuable insights into how your opponents construct their ranges, how they size their bets, and how they react under pressure. These observations, when processed and remembered, allow you to make more accurate decisions in future hands, often turning marginal spots into profitable ones. The edge gained from attentive observation is especially pronounced in low to mid-stakes tournaments, where players frequently reveal their tendencies openly, and where the majority of the field does not capitalize on this information. One of the most significant benefits of observing hands from the rail is the ability to see showdowns that reveal the actual holdings of your opponents. When a player calls a large river bet and tables top pair, for example, you gain direct evidence of how that player constructs their calling range in that spot. This information can be used to adjust your own betting and bluffing frequencies in future encounters. Bet sizing is another critical signal. Players who consistently use large bets, such as 70 to 100% of the pot, are often polarized, meaning they are likely to have either very strong hands or complete bluffs. Conversely, smaller bets in the range of 25 to 50% of the pot tend to indicate a more merged range, often weighted toward value hands. By tracking these patterns, you can make more informed fold or raise decisions when facing similar situations. Timing tells and action frequency are also repeatable behaviors that attentive players can exploit. Some opponents snap call with marginal hands, while others take a long time before making a big raise, often indicating strength or uncertainty. These timing patterns, when observed consistently, can be weighted alongside other information to refine your understanding of an opponent's likely holdings. It is important to consider the context of stack depths and positions when interpreting these signals. The same action from a player with a deep stack may have a different meaning than from a short-stacked player, so always condition your conclusions on the relevant tournament dynamics. When you are out of the hand, there are specific behaviors and patterns to focus on. Showdown hands provide the most concrete data, as you see exactly what an opponent was willing to play and how they navigated the board runout. Each revealed hand is a data point for reconstructing their pre-flop opening and defending ranges, as well as their post-flop continuation frequencies. Bet sizing patterns by street and position are also revealing. By noting whether a player uses standard open sizes pre-flop or varies their continuation bet sizes on the flop, turn, and river, you can correlate these choices with the strength of hands shown down and adjust your own strategy accordingly. Action frequency is another area to monitor. Keep track of how often a player 3-bets, check raises or floats, and whether these actions are accompanied by quick decisions or long pauses. These frequencies become priors that you can use when assigning ranges and making pot odds calculations. Emotional and physical reactions at the table, such as signs of frustration after a lost pot or visible excitement after a big win, can indicate short-term changes in a player's tendencies. For example, a player who just suffered a bad beat may become more prone to loose calls or aggressive plays in the following hands. Table image and adaptation signals are also important. If you notice that the table tightens up in response to a particular player's aggression, you can exploit this dynamic by adjusting your own opening and bluffing frequencies. Turning observation into action requires a deliberate approach to recording and encoding the information you gather. Use simple mental labels to store observed facts, such as noting that a player on the button only 3 bets with premium pairs and Broadway combinations, or that another player frequently bluffs with small continuation bets. These labels can then be mapped to actionable range adjustments, allowing you to narrow or widen your own ranges in response. When you observe that an opponent overfolds to river pressure, you can increase your bluffing frequency in late position and take advantage of their tendency to release marginal hands. Conversely, if you see that a player is a sticky caller, you should reduce your bluffing and focus on extracting value with thinner hands. Memory management is crucial, especially in tournament settings, where stack depths and blind levels change frequently. Prioritize recent and high-impact observations, such as hands involving large pots or those played at similar stack depths. As the tournament progresses and dynamics shift, allow older observations to fade in importance, focusing instead on the most relevant and timely information. Practical adjustments based on observation can include altering your bet sizes or choosing different lines depending on what you have seen. For example, if you have noticed that a player consistently folds to large river shoves when short stacked, you can exploit this by shoving lighter in those spots, knowing that your fold equity is higher than average. To illustrate the consequences of neglecting this edge, consider a hand played at 60 big blinds, effective between a player in the hijack and another on the button. The player in the hijack is known to play a standard middle position range, which includes hands like ace of spades, with jack of spades, king of clubs with queen of clubs, pocket nines, pocket sevens, queen of spades with 10 of spades, and suited connectors down to 7 of spades with 6 of spades. The player on the button, holding king of spades with queen of spades, faces a situation that will test the value of attentive observation. In a previous hand, the hijack had triple-barreled on a similar board texture, firing bets on every street with a missed flush draw. After being called, the hijack revealed queen of spades with 10 of spades at showdown, showing a willingness to run a multi-street bluff with a missed draw. However, the button was distracted during this hand and did not register this critical piece of information. Now, in the current hand, the hijack once again opens the action. The button calls, and the flop comes 8 of clubs, 7 of diamonds, and 2 of spades. The hijack continuation bets, and the button calls, holding second pair and a backdoor flush draw at this stage. The turn brings the 4 of spades, adding a flush draw to the button's hand. The hijack bets again, and the button, still with second pair, and now a flush draw, faces a decision. Unaware of the hijack's previous bluffing tendency in these spots, the button chooses to fold, giving up a pot that could have been won with a call. The river would have completed the board with the 2 of diamonds, but the hand ends as soon as the button folds on the turn. This hand demonstrates how failing to observe and remember key information can directly lead to suboptimal decisions. The hijack's earlier triple-barrel bluff, with a missed flush draw, was a clear indicator of their willingness to apply pressure with weak holdings on similar board textures. Had the button been attentive and processed this information, they could have recognized the likelihood of another bluff and made a profitable call with second pair and a strong draw. Instead, by not paying attention when out of the hand, the button missed an opportunity to exploit a repeatable tendency and surrendered a pot unnecessarily. The lesson is clear. Consistent observation, even when not directly involved in the action, is a crucial edge in poker. By watching every hand, noting bet sizes, timing tells, and emotional reactions, and encoding these observations for future use, you position yourself to make more accurate and profitable decisions. In soft tournament fields, where players often reveal their strategies openly, this edge can be the difference between a marginal session and a deep run. Treat every hand at the table as a source of valuable information, and never let distraction cost you the opportunity to capitalize on your opponent's tendencies.